Okay, everyone, I think we'll begin. My name is Mark Hallett. I'm the director here at the Courtauld, and really it's going to be the greatest of pleasure to offer you the warmest of welcomes to this study day. And it's really fantastic to see so many of you here, and I think that's just a testament to the power and the success of the exhibition that we're running at the moment. And I'm so happy to see you here, and I hope that we'll really be able to offer you a really stimulating and exciting day over the next few hours. So I just wanted to say that, of course, this study day has been organised to accompany our current exhibition, Frank Auerbach, The Portrait Heads, which, as many of you will know, is curated by my colleague and our colleague, Barney Wright. But unfortunately, Barney, who would have been doing this introduction, in fact, has gone down with COVID. He's fine, but he's struggling and he can't join us today, so I'm sorry that he won't be able to be with us. But I just wanted to say on his behalf, really, that this exhibition has been very long in the making. Indeed, it's been in the making ever since 2010. Because in that year, Barney curated an exhibition for Courtauld that in some ways served as a kind of sequel to the Charcoal Heads. And that exhibition, 14 years ago or so, was entitled Frank Auerbach, London Building Sites, 1952-1962. A number of you may have seen that show. And as its title suggests, that focused on the kind of imagery that, alongside his painted and drawn portraits, dominated Auerbach's output in that post-war period. And it focused on the building sites that was such a ubiquitous part of London's landscape at that moment. But even as Barney delivered that display, which, like the current exhibition, generated widespread critical acclaim, he was already thinking about a show of charcoal heads from the same period. And he's now realised that ambition and given us the chance not only to focus on these astonishing drawings, but also to think about, for instance, the ways in which they related to the kind of imagery that we exhibited in 2010 to that building site and imagery. And we'll be looking at that today to think about how we can think of those kinds of works in relation to one another. And it's that kind of question, and the fact that there's so many other questions that we can ask Auerbach's charcoal heads, that prompted Barney and I to think about organising a study day to accompany our show. And in doing so, both of us agreed that it would be great to involve a new voice in Auerbach studies. We were delighted that Altair Brandon Salmon, who's doing some really exciting research on British art of the post-war period, agreed to take the lead in drafting the call for papers for this study day, and in working with our wonderful colleague, Leila Bumber, to organise today's proceedings. So huge thanks, Altair, for all the work you've done in making today happen. So Altair, Barney and I agree that the most stimulating format for such study days tends to take the form, we think at least, of a series of short talks, written as interventions and provocations rather than as detailed or polished research papers. Short talks designed to prompt good debate and discussion, and to suggest new and sometimes surprising perspectives on the artist or the subject at hand. And that's the format, as you'll have seen, that we've chosen today. So the talks will be around 10 minutes long each, so, and I'll give you a chance to pack in. We've given us the chance to pack in a whole range of different voices and perspectives too. So yeah, that's the format that we've chosen today. And I know our list of speakers will constantly ask us to think afresh about Auerbach's post-war drawings. That's their challenge, and I'm sure they'll rise to it. And in doing so, they'll be responding not only to the current exhibition and the accompanying catalogue that Barney's edited, that I'd thoroughly recommend that you pick up and buy. And it contains not only Barney's own introductory text to the show, but also an amazing essay in it by the writer Colm Tobin, many of you will know, who's written this really extended meditation on looking at a single work by Auerbach. In fact, the self-portrait that adorns the catalogue's cover, I think he did it for 5 or so hours, in fact, sitting and living with that image in that sort of time, writing his notes and then writing them up and turning them into this pretty profound meditation, not only on the work, on the appearance of portraiture in the novels of people like Henry James, Thomas Mann, Joseph Conrad, writers that Colm Tobin has himself written about at great length in the past. So, yeah, in terms of today's talks, they'll respond, I think, to the kind of writing that we've incorporated in this catalogue, but also to a recent book that I had the pleasure of co-editing with the great curator and art historian Catherine Lambert. And this is a book called Frank Auerbach, Drawings of People, that was published by the Paul Mellon Centre last year, last year, or even possibly back in 22 now, and that contains a whole range of essays about the portrait drawings. And so it's extraordinary in a way that this project developed pretty much entirely in isolation from, or without full recognition of, the fact that this exhibition has been developed. So it's wonderful that we have, I think, both this catalogue and this book to provide some really weighty and interesting critical commentary on the kind of exhibition and the works that we've got on display at the moment. But this book, as I said, tried to provide some new ways of looking at and contextualising Auerbach's portrait drawings. And I'm delighted that 3 of the contributors to that book are going to be speaking in our first session today and offering their newest thoughts on the artist's works. Our other sessions, meanwhile, are going to give us a chance of hearing other new voices in Auerbach studies and of thinking about his drawings from yet more perspectives. Our second session, chaired by Sarah Turner, who is here somewhere, I just saw walking in, wonderful former colleague of mine, of course, back at the Paul Mellon Centre, now director of the Paul Mellon Centre. That session will ask us to think about how Auerbach's works can be suggestively situated in relation to that of other artists. While our third and final session, which I'll be chairing, promises a rich mix of perspectives, again, ranging from Altair's investigation of one remarkable strand of Auerbach's practice, his portraits of Gerda Bohm, to the poet Pele Cox's experiment in painting a portrait in verse, to Peter Davison's investigation of how Auerbach's works might be placed in productive dialogue with those by his contemporary Mervyn Peake. So, a really rich day ahead, and crucial to its success, though, and this one's really what I want to dwell upon, will be your involvement and the discussions we'll be having together across the next few hours. All the talks, as I've said, will be short, about 10 minutes long, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions and observations and conversation. So please join in, whether through asking questions of our speakers or offering your own observations and arguments about Auerbach's drawings. These drawings are, of course, famous for their energy and their depth and their quality and their originality. But let's try and match them, or at least try and match them somewhere near, in the energy and the depth and the quality and the conversation, and the originality of our own conversation. But remember, too, that Auerbach constantly wiped away his first ideas and started again. So don't worry whatsoever about throwing in an idea that seems very speculative or half-formed. The best thinking, it seems to me, always involves trying things out, essaying a possible way of looking, making a stab at a productive comparison. So let's try and do that together today. And it always involves collaboration and feedback. So I think this is a perfect forum in which to start thinking again, really originally, about Auerbach's drawings. And I really look forward to thinking and talking together today. Wonderful. So I'm, as I said, chairing the first panel. So I think we'll kick off, and we've got 3 speakers. They'll be speaking in order and together, in succession rather, sorry. And I'll quickly introduce them all now, and then we'll hear them in succession, and then have a chance to gather them all together at this table and get you to ask questions of them and to have a conversation with you all about things that they talked about. So our 3 speakers in this first session are Dr. James Finch, who's Assistant Curator of 19th Century British Art at Tate Britain, Dr. Kate Aspinall, who's an independent art historian, and someone who's a great expert on drawing and whose PhD focused on that subject. And then our third speaker is Alex Masouras, both one of those rare people who's both a brilliant artist and a brilliant critic and writer. So it's great to have Alex with us as well. And so all 3, as I mentioned, contributed to the book we produced at the PMC. It would be great to hear their updated thoughts on Auerbach's drawings. So can I begin by asking James to come here and talk about a paper described or entitled "Nothing One Began With But a New Fact: Destruction and Creation in Auerbach's Drawings." Thanks very much indeed. Thank you.
Hello everyone. Thanks Mark, and thanks to Altair and everyone involved in organising this wonderful event. In 1959, at the end of his first decade as an artist, Frank Auerbach published his most extensive artist statement to date, Fragments from a Conversation, which appeared in the first issue of the quarterly arts periodical X. You can see the title page here. As the title suggests, the text is neither a piece of prose written directly by Auerbach, nor a conventional interview, but fragments of conversation which were assembled by the author Elizabeth Smart. The choice of both publication and format are noteworthy. Auerbach, an artist known for his love of poetry and literature, is situated in a primarily literary context in which his text is followed by Samuel Beckett's L'Image, Moreover, the text itself is fragmentary, full of hesitations and ellipses, rejecting immediate legibility in favour of a more complex process. All of this makes it a fitting written analogue to Auerbach's artistic practice, contemporary with the heads in the Courtauld Gallery exhibition. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the text is the frequency with which Auerbach uses the word destroy or other conjugations of the verb, 12 times in all. A few examples are as follows. One must be perpetually willing to destroy. In painting, one destroys everything. In life, one can't do it. I've destroyed all the reminders, that is, of painting, to get a unique thing. The thing is to get other people's rules and destroy them and get one's own. And the only possible progress is to destroy. Then one's left with nothing one began with, but a new fact. In this brief paper, I want to think about some of the dimensions of this poetics of destruction. The several meanings of the words destroy and destruction vary in the degree to which they emphasize either the act of undoing or the way in which that process occurs, both of which are relevant in this case. To begin with the process by which Auerbach's early charcoal heads were made, we know that this involved repeatedly drawing and erasing a likeness on the sheet of paper until, as the artist later stated, the drawing, quote, had risen out of the battle into being an image that stands up for itself. This was a process of making and unmaking which eventually led to a resolution, in the process of which the effort involved in that process was recorded on the support. Auerbach's self-portrait of 1958, to which Con Toibin devoted his catalogue essay, and several hours of direct observation, demonstrates with particular clarity the way in which reckoning with the tears and patchings to the support is a necessary part of experiencing these works. Toibin describes it in relation to collage and disparate textures stitched together. This is perhaps not intentional on Auerbach's part, and in several cases Auerbach preemptively reinforced the support by attaching two sheets of paper, which somewhat mitigated the need for patching in at later stages. On a recent visit to the exhibition, I overheard visitors comparing the damage to the paper to either skin peeling, blistering, or even scarring, with particular reference to the head of Kossoff seen here, as if to draw a parallel between the human body and the paper support. But even if we do not subscribe to this particular interpretation, the damage sustained to the support is a record and making visible of the intensity and duration in producing these drawings. Auerbach's drawings do seem to me to epitomize Picasso's description of his pictures in 1935 to Christian Zervaux as not a sum of additions, but a sum of destructions. In Auerbach's early paintings, this process is concealed beneath the accumulation of layer upon layer of paint, which lends them an organic living quality, perhaps a sum of additions. The drawings, however, are a sum of destructions, not only in the patching in of paper, but also in the erasing of lines in which a hard typewriter rubber becomes a drawing implement in itself. Auerbach's willingness to absorb this damage into the visual experience of his work rather than seeking to conceal it is something that he shared with artists such as Lucio Fontana, whose first Concetto Spaziale, spatial concepts, are contemporary with Auerbach's earliest charcoal heads, and Gustav Metzger, who is perhaps particularly relevant in this regard. Metzger studied alongside Auerbach in David Bomberg's class at the Borough Polytechnic and was, in the early 1950s, the occupant of the Camden studio, which passed to Leon Kossoff before Auerbach took it on. The 1950s for Metzger was a decade in which he moved from making charcoal drawings, including drawings of Auerbach, some of which were exhibited in his 1960 Temple Gallery show. You can see the list of works for that show here, alongside one of Metzger's drawings of Auerbach, before swiftly moving to abstraction and the auto-destructive art which David Meller, in his essay about context for Auerbach's charcoal heads, relates to some of Auerbach's drawings. He specifically connects the heads of Gerda Böhm with the South Bank performance in 1959, in which Metzger threw acid against nylon screens. The 1950s were a decade of reconstruction and reckoning with the aftermath of the Second World War, which was visible across Auerbach's work of this period, particularly in his series of paintings of London building sites, arising from a fascination with the rebuilding of London after the war. This body of work was the subject of an exhibition at the Courtauld Gallery in 2012. In portraiture, meanwhile, exhibitions of the 1950s, such as New Images of Man at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, surveyed a strain of portraiture that spoke to ideas of suffering humanity inflected by post-war anxieties. Auerbach's work was not included in this exhibition, but one can certainly see it as in dialogue with those included, such as Francis Bacon, Jean de Buffet, and Willem de Kooning. A common concern amongst Auerbach's generation, encapsulated in those building site paintings, was that of rebuilding or restarting from first principles, which in Auerbach's case applied not only in a material sense, but also in asserting his independence as an artist. As he stated in Fragments from a Conversation, quote, "The thing is to get other people's rules and destroy them and get one's own." Auerbach was rigorous in his study of historic art, and in another early artist statement, he wrote, quote, "I do not think of myself as a rebel. For a year, I drew almost every day at the National Gallery." And you can see here one of his studies after Turner's painting, The Parting of Hero and Leander, in the National Gallery. At the same time, Auerbach wanted to find ways of evading the formulae he found in other artists. He said, for instance, that, quote, "Even infinitely more powerful painters than me who do portraiture eventually get into certain habits, so that a painter who is as magically, inexplicably gifted as Gainsborough, or an enormously talented painter like Sargent, when they get down to painting a stranger, they get into certain habits," end quote. Sargent, incidentally, was also prolific in charcoal, but nothing could be further from Auerbach's charcoal drawings than those that Sargent was making as recently as 25 years earlier. For Sargent, the charcoal portrait was a single-sitting exercise in virtuosity, a consolation prize for patrons who he no longer wished to paint in oils. For Auerbach, rather, the intention seems to have been to exhaust the potential of the charcoal portrait as a medium, both in terms of what his media could sustain and what his sitters could tolerate, and I think here of the clouds of dust gathering in EOW's flat. It's as if the artist wondered, what would it be like to pour all of the exertion of an oil painting into a drawing? Destroying other people's rules, destroying ideas about how a work of art is expected to look, these were ways for Auerbach to create conditions for him to work. Indeed, Fragments from a Conversation appeared in X alongside The Dream, The Sphinx, and the Death of Tea, a text by Alberto Giacometti, one of Auerbach's artistic heroes, who, Auerbach said, quote, "offered hope to carry on and give everything for a truthful art without any compromises." Giacometti, as much as any artist working during this period, epitomized for Auerbach the integrity which he sought to emulate. This idea of a new fact, which Auerbach wanted to bring into being, is evident in the works themselves, but it was equally amplified through the statements and texts through which he accompanied his emergence as an artist during the post-war period, and through which he set out a manifesto of his ideas and aims as an artist. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you. I'm going to talk very casually today about how Auerbach really used the means and the ideas, the notions of what traditional drawing is, to return to this notion of figure and ground, revising it, reordering it. And in doing so, how he created a remarkable sense of underneathness and depth in his materials. I chose as the title page this absolutely stunning moment of beautiful damage. We've just heard wonderfully about the various ways destruction works. This is the melting away of Stella's forehead, head of EOW, 1957. And I love this one particularly. This is a research photograph I took when we were working on the book, because you see the forcefulness of the charcoal line that talks about or describes the horizon of her head. And so you see him working, weaving through the damage and the real decisions that's made in that moment. But a lot of my research has primarily looked at his later drawings. And by later, I mean his return in 1973. He took a brief hiatus after producing the charcoal heads that are on such beautiful display at the Courtauld. And I'm going to come back to these early pieces, but just to divert to explain what I mean by figure and ground and underneathness, this kind of labor is much more visible in these later pieces, because Auerbach is working and thinking much more linearly. He's using lines and marks on the surface in ways that are easier for us to follow his hand, or at least maybe suggests that they are. So when I talk about figure and ground, I'm of course referring to the Gestalt psychological notion that we reflexively read something as being in the foreground and something as being in the background, and that it's impossible to overlay these two things. We make an instant visual decision. And how Auerbach has played with that in his use of marks and surfaces. This is really beautifully summed up in this wonderful quote that he gave during a talk at the Royal Drawing School of William Fever in 2007, where, talking about color, he said, "I think about it as a form of drawing. That is, I think this is coming forward, and this is making a connection. This is establishing an echo somewhere. This is cutting through the morass that I've gotten into." I think that's extremely profound as a way to think about what marks were for Auerbach. That each of these lines is a cutting mark. And what I mean by that, especially in relation to figure and ground, is this notion of redrawing, which we've already heard about. But in these pieces, he would work for 20 or 30 multiple-hour sessions on a single piece of paper, often erasing it down to what he called ghost drawings, and then starting again, letting the mesh and the lattice of what remained suggest what would come first. But when we think about cutting the morass, it's almost as if each mark once made becomes the background. It becomes unimportant, transparent. And so when we view pieces like these two, which are some of my favorites of these, got Catherine Lampert 4 of 1979 and Hedda Julia of 1985, we have lines, many drawings condensed in, but the lines creating almost sedimentary layers, meshes, that our eye slips between as we try to read the coherent image. Especially in Catherine Lampert, our urge, our reflex to read for humans becomes complicated. We almost fall optically between the layers of these marks into a depth, which is where the focus on underneathness goes. But this is conceptually relevant for looking at his earlier pieces. This process of labor, in this case amassing the labor rather than erasing it, is very operative in these early pieces. Partly just the density of the work that he put here. But one of the things that's come to interest me ever since I started looking at Auerbach is how he is working through this in the more private spaces, not necessarily his presentation drawings, by which I mean the drawings that are intentionally conceived of as operating in an exhibiting context, to be consumed as fine art, if you will, rather than research drawings. When we look at his very early pieces, these are from the life rooms of his art schools, and Reclining Nude 1955 is a sort of later piece. But this first one, the one on the far left, was done in the life room at St. Martin's under Vivian Pitchforth. And we see a much more conventional notion of the body depicted in line. The second one, Standing Nude, is reported by Auerbach to have been done at the RCA, where we think it's likely he was either taught by Robert Buehler or by John Minton. And here we see him doing again this notion of line and space, figure and ground, but almost sort of falling into different ways of conceiving how you can collapse the two. And it's worthwhile noting that although these weren't done at the Borough Polytechnic under Bomberg's class, this is very much at the same time that he was moonlighting, doing what he called the messy, great undulation of grandeur of charcoal that was going on there. But what interests me about these is this use of the red line, the red mark, as another early version of him thinking through the cutting line of the quotation I gave you from 2007, trying to find ways to create a convincing mass of the surface of these drawings, which I think he perfected in the portrait heads in the exhibition. But here, in these more private, early, transitional moments, playing with the red as a way to cut, to delegate into the background the otherwise busyness of these surfaces. And what's interesting is he comes back to this after he does the run of these early heads, in the transitional period, right before he gives up drawing for a time. And so these early heads, they become more graphically complex in 1958, And he does the last one that doesn't get subsumed to paint in 62. But before he does this, in 1960, 1962, he begins to use this red line to experiment with this process of delegation, this cutting redness. Here, it's still very much accent. And this is interesting as well because accents, linear accents, are something that he very much disavowed. This is another quote from 1978 in conversation with Catherine Lampert, where he said, "I remember making an effort in his early works to not make any linear accents, but to simply make a convincing mass out of these surfaces. And in a way, one exhausts an effort. One takes a thing as far as it will go, and then one does what one can with another idiom." Now, Auerbach is famous for talking about the transition that he made in the early 70s to working on much more shallow painted and drawing surfaces. In drawing, this was largely transitioning to a much thicker paper, which he said asked more of him, but it could also take more abuse. And so he sort of disavows in a humbling way these aesthetic choices. And so this is in some ways has to be queried as him looking back on an earlier, now obsolete way of making very mass, very heavy drawings and disavowing it. But in another sense, I think this is a really important quotation in that it shows that what he was reacting against when he creates these massed pictures was almost a fear of the linearity in drawing, that it would speak to people's expectations of something sketchy, autobiographical, the little mark, the fleeting note, and that he wanted to make something that famously lived on its own, in its own terms. And yet, he clearly was thinking about linear accents, not necessarily about accents as accents, but how to order his substances. And so to wrap this back into these runs of early heads, what I think is important here is this notion of the figure and ground, the surface and the mark, the depth, the underneathness. How it manifests here is not only the sense of laboring, but it's the emphasis of the materiality, the sculptural object. That when we engage with these pieces, as we've heard so beautifully from James, we're dealing with the paper as this vulnerable but also thick substance. Oh, and I should go back here just a moment to say these are some various ways that he does abuse his paper. And interestingly enough, I wanted to give you this because he does so often put, I think, an abundance of pinholes in the corners. And I've been in one private collection where the piece still had staples in those corners. And there's an element of accidental, possibly, joyful, definitely. So I do encourage you always to look at the edge of his pictures because I think those are very much materially adamant as their own beings. But we have also the scars and then the patch. And I am very curious about whether Auerbach conceived of the patches before or after. He talks about them as patches, but so often they bisect points of particular anatomical vulnerability. Here, Stella's neck is ripped jaggedly. And so the consciousness working backwards and forwards from notions of corporeal damage is very clear. But coming back to what I was talking about with the figure, the ground, and the perplexing sense of underneathness, this sense of paper as an object, paper as labored, really brings us into an unavoidable confrontation with it as a material fact. And yet, to read something like his stunning self-portrait of 1958, we have to look through the various panes of patches that are in between us and his eyes in order to read this as a human. We are making the paper invisible, but we are also, because of its adamancy as a feature, particularly fixated by it. And thus our perceptual reflex to read something as invisible or visible is intentionally and beautifully confounded. We oscillate in a kind of paradox of legibility in these pieces. And so although that is very evident in the linear works of his later period, in this sheer sense of the papery paperness, the way paper interposes itself, I'd say that it is equally part of the power of these early works. Thank you.
So thank you everyone for the invitation today. Thank you Altair, Mark, Sarah, fellow speakers. I also wanted a quick note of gratitude and thanks to the late David Mellor, with whom I enjoyed talking about Auerbach so much, and his contributions will be, I think, very missed today. Yeah, I'm talking today about resemblance, which is an enormous idea in painting and drawing. So perhaps a very ill-chosen subject for a 10-minute talk. It is the question in making marks of what is the thread that binds the image that you're inventing anew and the world outside that informs or inspires it. What does it mean to paint what you see or draw what you see? It's a question that doesn't go away and that I think I don't know the answer to. But with that in mind, so I'm taking my conceptual framework from this. It's inspired by this Gertrude Stein poem, If I Told Him, a Completed Portrait of Picasso, from 1923. Why is it so relevant for thinking about resemblance in Auerbach's work? Well, let me explain. It has, I won't read it all, it has these rhythms of looping, almost repetitions are a sort of leitmotif of the poem. It's dance with completion, both in the title, A Completed Portrait of Picasso, which is constantly undermined by its distracted, fragmentary qualities. And its terminology, it alights, it emphasizes very heavily shutters, which for me takes us to photography, the camera shutter, or just being shuttered away maybe in Mornington Crescent. But most particularly, the way that it lands on the question of resemblance, and I will read this bit. So top left is the Vanity Fair publication that it first appeared in, then that's a little excerpt, and I shall read from the excerpt there. Exact resemblance, where are we? Almost at the bottom. Exact resemblance to exact resemblance, the exact resemblance as exact resemblance, exactly as resembling, exactly resembling, exactly in resemblance, exactly and resemblance. So, what does it mean when thinking about resemblance in Auerbach's drawings? I've divided them into 5 types of resemblance. The first one, which deserves a parenthesis because it's so such a given in this type of drawing, I suppose, is resemblance to the sitter. A boilerplate aspect of portraiture or head drawing, but nonetheless, I think remarkable in Auerbach's work, and I speak with personal experience of having first recognized 2 people, Catherine Lambert and David Landau, from having seen drawings. So there is this discombobulating and weird thing of being able to recognizing someone like a celebrity through these drawings that are so mediated by abstraction and that look so implausible as vessels for communicating the resemblance of a person to me. So that's resemblance 1. Resemblance 2 is a resemblance within the drawings themselves, and I've stolen these slides from the catalogue of the new exhibition, and we can see this. We're looking here at the finished drawing, and then these archival photographs of drawings in earlier states. Not that we can really call them earlier states. And looking at these, I wondered: is this a legitimate form of resemblance? Is this always true? When you make, am I just describing visual editing essentially? As an image evolves, that it will always look a little bit like it did before, and a little different. Can we describe that as resemblance? Maybe so. But I do think if it is always true for the process of making something, it is super true when looking at Auerbach. For reasons that he gives us, there's something distinctive going on. He doesn't think of these, as we know, as earlier states. He talks of them as destroyed drawings. So there's a reason to separate these, cut them cleanly in time, and consider them as individual drawings, and then therefore to think about the resemblance that they might have to their earlier pre-drawing self. So that's one example from the catalogue, and this is another just making the same point. Then, of course, we have type 3 of resemblance, resemblances between different drawings of the same sitter. Sometimes these have such deliberate affinities that they express a kind of printerly impulse, almost of editioning, which I think takes us back to what Kate was just saying about figure and ground, this relationship. Cutting, as described there in drawing, is fundamentally a printerly mode of making marks. And there's, this resemblance occurs across the drawings, and it matches or describes maybe the process, observing people over a very long period of time in every sense. Aging comes into play. This is like seeing different generations of the same family, or perhaps evokes the metaphor of the Argo with its replaced timbers. They point us, I think, these drawings, these series of drawings, to thinking about the continuity of personhood. How do we differ from our younger selves? Can we think of someone in their 40s, 50s, or 60s as resembling their 20 or 30-year-old self? I think this is a kind of resemblance that is manifested in these drawings. Worth saying, no doubt, that resemblance of this type happens elsewhere in art. Two famous examples there. And this wonderful work by Via Selmens, To Fix the Image in Memory, that I always go back to. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it sets up the relationship between the found pebble and the elaborately created mimetic representation or replica of the pebble, created in bronze and then painted afterwards and then displayed as these confusing pairings where suddenly everything is thrown into question. Which is the original? Is it the work that the artist has carefully made, or is it the found object? So, resemblance we see elsewhere, but I will come back to why it matters more with Auerbach. No, not yet. So we can go. My fourth type of resemblance is a slightly more abstracted resemblance. It's what we account for in terms of style, describing style. One of those will-o'-the-wisps, which can only mean anything with populations of images or objects. So I think when we go back and look at Auerbach drawings, we're seeing the resemblance of the sitter across time to themselves in different phases. But we're also seeing the resemblance to Auerbach, to his work, to Auerbach's space. There is arguably these drawings resemble him as much as they can resemble the sitter, and they're sort of loaded with all these other resemblances that surround what is ostensibly the subject. So yes, the fifth kind of resemblance is something more mysterious, and it's difficult to articulate, so I'm resorting to, again, slightly questionable metaphors. But this is the film Together, which we know from David Mellor, Auerbach went to see at the first National Film Theatre screening in 1956 with Helen Massaw and Francis Bacon, actually. And I've got it here because watching this film, I don't really see the characters. I see Michael Andrews and Edoardo Palozzi. What is this? What do those resemblances mean? And it's a film, so it can be used to clumsily segue into thinking about another thing that Auerbach always brings me to, which is these images of Edward Muybridge and the incremental shifting of images over time. In film, rapid regression through still images obscures each individual image, but in return gives the watcher a sense of the film's view in dynamic time. This parallel is useful because moving images inhabit a strange space where the viewer's perception depends on seeing both what is and what isn't there. To use Gombrich's phrase for the collaborative quality of perception, this is the beholder's share. The viewer provides the assumptions of continuity necessary to stitch together sequences unfolding on the screen, which is really beautifully evoked in this film by the artist John Steziker called Marriage. And I've got a sort of representative still from it, but it's a film where he has assembled headshots from the golden age of cinema of actors. So these are images that are publicity images individualizing their sitters, but by rapidly playing them at the film's frequency, watching the film, the faces are completely obscured, and you're just left with this sort of these ghost faces that cohere but don't really. They're so divorced from their original purpose. Applied to Auerbach's portrait drawings, these properties carry particular force. Portraiture confronts the impossibilities of representing a subject as complicated and as unfixed as a person, which is why an image of a person in stickier time, fragmented and recongealed across multiple moments, has such weight in these charcoal heads. In 1959, as James mentioned, he spoke of trying to tie up the fact and the image, offering this kind of time-inflected truth. I think I've spent 10 minutes already, so I won't talk about that. But lastly, I just wanted to invite you all to my private view next Wednesday, where thinking about Auerbach has sort of made me think slightly differently about these paintings. We've been talking about heads of individuals in constant spaces that are unchanging, and I've been making figures that are anonymous and that are nowhere. But you'd be more than welcome to come and see them. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks Alex, and thanks all. Can we just now gather the three speakers here at the front? Great. Well, as I said, I'd really like to invite questions from the audience and to get a good discussion going between the three speakers and our speakers across the day, but also between the speakers and all of you, and even across and between you as you think about Auerbach's work. So, any questions that you'd like to ask to kick us off and to respond to the talks you've heard? And I think what we'll do is it looks like we're going to be bringing in a mic around. Thanks. Lynn, for you first. Thank
you very much, and thank you to all three speakers, because there are lots of ideas circulating. I was thinking in particular about James's paper on poetics and metaphors of destruction. And of course, there's a very long history of a kind of philosophy of destruction, and I use this deliberately, penetration of the brush, or by the brush or pencil, on the paper or the canvas. So there is a very long philosophy. I'm also thinking of a recent work by Derrida myself. But I wonder, for me, I can't even imagine that language without thinking about the gendering of it, the gendering of style and the gendering of the image of the artist. And I just wondered if you could, or any of the speakers, develop that. I know that Greg is going to talk about a different aspect, the materiality, but this is about style, the relationship of, the charcoal, the pencil, and the surface.
Yeah, no, that's a really great point, Lynn. I don't have any, I think that's very true, but I don't have any immediate thoughts. Do either of you have anything to say?
I do think you made an interesting point about the self-portrait in so many of these early heads, and they do have a existence kind of outside of gender. They all turn out to be somehow monolithic-looking, similar alien forms, where I find it interesting that he fixates more on the mood of the lips and their closedness. And when you talked about penetration, I was sort of curious also that these feel like heads that have no ability to communicate or to receive. They are almost sensory deprivation chamber pieces. And so I was sort of struck when you were saying that, both about your point of the similarity of what he's reading into this, and perhaps that also speaks to your point about him responding to Gainsborough falling into certain habits, and maybe that's part of a discussion to have about his relationship of sort of regret, but also joy in these early works that he's not returned to work in that style. But I also do think in terms of the gendering, there is a curious refusal is the wrong word, but needing something from his sitters that he's almost portraying not getting, and whether that could be conceived of in gender, perhaps. I've often wondered about that as the friendship relationship. Just from a human perspective, it's a very cruel thing to do, to have friendships that are based on sitting for you for hundreds of hours. The power of that, of them being locked in position, I think is a very interesting thing as well. So.
Lynn, did you want to say a word or two more about your perspectives on this question? Now that we've heard responses. It'd be really interesting, I think, for all of us to
Not particularly. It's just, having thought, and actually I think these questions are particularly sort of unavoidable when it's the head of the body. So actually I thought those work really new for me also raise these kinds of questions. And it's not about whether, I'm not trying to fix anything, it's just that those metaphors have such a long history of gender dissociation, and the destruction of the surface so visible, that it seems to me something that one would necessarily have to think about. As a question of poetics, which I think Auerbach is part of style itself.
Thanks very much indeed. Any other questions? Sarah?
I think there's a thread of connection here, and actually Kate, just picking up on something you mentioned, and actually just first of all to say I really enjoyed those presentations, actually really thought-provoking, and so I don't have a sort of fully formed question because I'm still thinking through the ideas that you all presented, but my thoughts landed on friendship and drawing, and I think I was struck, James, when you showed the Metzger's head of Auerbach, and then we also talked about Kossoff, and I was thinking about something about the intimacy of drawing, and then Kate, you were saying about the transactional nature of sitting as well, but something for Auerbach about charcoal and friendship, and can we make connections between the act of drawing and materiality, and using particular materials as well, something that has a texture of that's soft perhaps, but you've all talked about forcefulness as well, so I'm not quite so sure where I'm going with that, but I just want to kind of pick up on this idea of friendship and drawing, and I would actually love to see an exhibition of these friendship portraits as well. I think that could be very powerful, and see those dialogues between maybe people of a certain age drawing each other as well, and there's something there about being in a cohort and being in intimate conversation about your practice. So anyway, I'll leave that there, and I'm sure something more coherent will form in conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I mean, I think definitely in terms of that medium and the charcoal drawing, it's kind of has this long history of being associated with more informal and more intimate representations rather than kind of works made specifically for exhibition. And the majority of, I mean, I refer to Sargent's charcoal drawings, which were primarily kind of presentation drawings made to sitters, and they kind of have this kind of, yeah, they do have the kind of this intimacy associated with them. So I think that's a part of it, definitely. And of course, it is that intimacy with his sitters that in Auerbach's work he attributes to him being able to get away from templates and formulae and other people's rules, as he describes it, to kind of to reach something that's more specific and that new fact that he talks about. So that's definitely, the relationship with the sitter is really fundamental for him. And although I haven't really thought this through, I think there is something interesting about, as you say, the relationship between the softness of drawing and the charcoal medium and that force and that destructive element that Auerbach wants to kind of, he keeps talking about bringing to it. So there's something about kind of the tension and the dialectic and the relationship between the hard and the soft in these works, which perhaps gives something of that very unique quality.
But then isn't the, I mean, yes, the material has its own voice, and the softness might encourage intimacy in that way, but I think would we really describe a Sargent charcoal as intimate? I think it's part of the sense of intimacy comes from the almost, I mean, I don't really like using the word, but the style of it, that the tempestuous, laboured appearance of it that it seems to be more intimate, more revealing, more honest somehow. But yeah, I mean, I think I wouldn't want to let the material dictate too much the qualities of the image, because there are, I mean, think of silver point or engraved lines, which, like, surely there are some extremely intimate and documents of an encounter between an artist and a sitter in those media as well.
I would like to, I'll say, I think it's interesting, I mean, just building off your query on that, I mean, he talked about, I think this is in his son Jake's, one of the films he made, interviewing his father, about the aggressiveness of the charcoal, especially in the basement of Stella's home where she was posing, that there were just clouds of it everywhere, and she described the oppression of it being like cold, choked air. And it's also interesting that when he comes back to it in the 70s, he starts to use more and more pencil, and that being, for me, the more intimate, like friendly medium, because charcoal, it's messy, it's kind of violent. You agree, I agree with both of you about the stylistic intimacy that we get aesthetically from it. But I think there is something really interesting about what you're saying of where and how does politeness perhaps press down on him, and when its absence is perhaps telling. Because he talks quite a bit also about painting his wife Julia in acrylics rather than oils to have less mess in the spaces that they're sharing. And so there are these sort of interesting, very sort of anti-mythos like compromises that he makes from love, I would say. So,
Kind of just following up from Sarah's question, I just wanted to ask you all about whether you think that the actual practice of the way in which he organises portraits at Auerbach and the sitting is rather different to the conventional sitting in relation to its proximity. I've always got this sense, and it's very interesting that David Mellor, who we have to pay tribute to today, in his essay compared Auerbach's drawings of this period with Pinter's early film, an early film in which Pinter talks about having filmed it, where it was all really close up. They had no money. There was, very cramped quarters in some kind of house in the East End of London, and it was done very close up, and it generated a very particular, and from low down, it generated a very particular perspective. And do you get the sense that with these portraits that actually there's a kind of a closeness? It's almost as if if painting James here, or there's actually a closeness in relation to where Auerbach was doing those drawings from in relation to the sitter. It's actually rather unusual compared to the traditions of portraiture, and that's partly what generates that sense of closeness and intensity in the work. I don't, following on from what Claire said, I wonder if you think there's almost a kind of reshaping of the spatial dynamics of portraiture, which brings the artist and the sitter very close up in the actual practice of producing the portrait of them.
I think certainly. And I wonder if that relates to lighting as well, the proximity and the lighting, if it does have that filmmaking connection. I'm thinking of lenses and how a telephoto lens requires more light than a standard lens. So if you're filming further away, you would need more light for the situation. So maybe there's a link between that sort of contrasty lighting and the proximity as well.
Of course, James Hyman in Battle for Realism talks a lot about the trend in the 50s, and I believe you touched on this as well in your chapter. But Freud as well was doing that very close. Like the portrait of Garrick Brown is just the face, and that notion of the violence of proximity. I think it's a nice
violence of proximity.
Yes.
Nice phrase.
Again, going back to Stella's
yeah.
basement, I mean, he talks about on his knees before her. And so I think that question of reconstructing whether you're looking up, almost praying to your sitter, or looking down, violently close, it's a nice question.
Yes, and you have those kind of quite unexpected angles of the heads that kind of vary between sitters, which kind of seem to speak to that closeness, and also the kind of the lighting might have something to do with that very sharp chiaroscuro and kind of the amount of use of the eraser to get those very sharp contrasts.
Yes, thank you. Question there. Yes, all of you, feel encouraged to ask questions.
Another vague question for you. Alex, you mentioned the resemblance, and you showed a picture of the drawings at different stages. And I just wondered if you had any theories as to why he actually took those pictures. And I'm also curious as to where they were imprinted, the photographs of the stages. Were they into frames, or how did they come about?
So those ones, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they were found in Helen Lassaw's archive.
Yeah.
And I think I would have to speculate as to why they were taken, but it must have something to do with destruction. The possibility of these drawings being drawn away, lost completely, if no satisfactory drawing came from that process, then presumably that photograph was simply a record of that failed endeavour. But maybe the documenting of the stage, not we can call it a stage, but maybe that becomes redundant if the drawing is successful in the end. I don't know. It does seem like a slightly counterintuitive thing if you're so dissatisfied with the work that you want to keep going, come what may, that you should also record it just in case. Yeah.
Isabel.
Thank you all so much. I really enjoyed those papers, and I think what each of them touched on was the sort of the idea of distraction, the kind of violence that came with that, and this sort of idea of erasure and reinstatement. And I couldn't help but think of the post-war landscape in which these artists were living, and seeing these transitions between the bomb sites, the building sites, that Alan also was recording, and whether you think, or to what extent do you think that this external world, the sort of landscape, affected the way that he approached these drawings? Do you think that there is a sort of link between that kind of destroyed environment and the transition between bomb sites and building sites sort of impacted these works?
I think I can't speak from particular experience, but certainly I think the fact that he had such a fecund inspiration from building sites, specifically building sites, especially when they were at that sort of whole stage where it's all malleability, I think speaks to that being a definite consciousness.
But the building sites often look like ruinscapes as well.
Yes.
I wonder if it comes back to charcoal. I mean, charcoal is such a burnt material. It would be hard to imagine using it in that period without some trace, memory or awareness of what burnt out buildings look and smell like, actually.
Yeah, and certainly he's talking about the building sites in that fragments from a conversation, and that's all kind of segued into this needing to start from scratch and get rid of everything that went before and pare everything back and restart. So I think that's all part of the general rhetoric of Auerbach's artist statements around this time. And I think also, just as a side point, something that I was thinking of in relation to this talk is that there's kind of like a growth in new artist magazines and forums and catalogues in which artist statements were solicited. And so I think it's kind of a time when you get this proliferation of artist statements where artists are themselves being invited to kind of project their thoughts into this kind of empty space, either with or without an interlocutor, which I think is, in a way that's perhaps slightly different to the previous generation, is kind of asking them to kind of articulate their thoughts and their vision in a way that kind of is itself kind of a form of starting anew.
He speaks a lot about idiom.
Sorry, could you just wait for the mic? Speak quite loudly into the mic, that'd be great.
He speaks a lot about idiom. And I think the idiom Auerbach chooses was obviously as one is chosen, but I think the fact he found himself in 1950s London, and that the idiom that he chose was possibly, it seems to me, predicated by the area he found himself within. So the building sites would have had some effect on the way the pictures look, but had he found himself somewhere different, then the idiom would have been in correspondence and in parallel to the place he found himself.
Can I say something to that? It wasn't only...
1 second, you can wait for the... We'd love you to say something to it, but can you just wait for the mic? Thank you.
Hello. The gentleman's just said something that I was thinking about, because that time in London it was very much the smogs. And also I believe where Auerbach lived was very near the railway line, big railway line coming into King's Cross. Lot of you may not remember, but there were steam trains. It was all dirty and mucky and grey. So.
Okay, thank you. There's more hands coming up as we... Yeah.
I wasn't aware of that connection with Pinter, but it set me thinking the way that early Pinter plays very often set in dark cellars in the solitariness and the threat of violence there. There seems to be thematic connections there.
No, I agree. I think there's a really interesting parallel there. Thank you. Other questions? We've got some from this side now. Hands are racing up. Okay, Colin.
Yeah, one thing that we haven't mentioned that screams out at me the longer I get to know these amazing pictures by this amazing man. There was an interview with Frank on Radio 4, This Comfortable Life, but I hope if you haven't heard it, listen to it. It's on BBC Sounds. But he said something there that actually quite floored me, because I got to know Frank in the 1970s when I'd been pestering him to help me with my dissertation as an undergraduate at Manchester University. And he was really kind to me. And as time passed, I ended up at the National Gallery and curated his 1995 exhibition there. made a film with him, got to know him pretty well. And in this interview, he says, for the first time, I have perhaps been guilty of doing what you're told you really shouldn't do if you've gone through some kind of trauma, which is burying it. And Frank has always denied. When I was a student, naively, I said, so how did that affect you? Losing your parents, waking up in a foreign country, not speaking the language and all of that? He said it didn't. And that he got a Red Cross package with his father's watching in 1945 and the news that they'd all been exterminated. And he said, it meant nothing to me. I went down into a shop and sold it. And every time since then, when I've seen people try to address that with him, he said, no, didn't affect me at all. And that statement in the This Cultural Life programme, I found it really quite, Frank, at last. What we can actually see in your paintings that you've been saying isn't there, actually is there. And we're talking about destruction, violence, darkness, the site of the City of London that had been flattened. How can it not have made this young kind of 20-year-old think, oh yeah, my family were flattened as well? And he's always denied it until like a month ago. And I just see that screaming out of these beautiful, beautiful moving pictures that are on show at Claude's on that moment.
Sorry, just to say, well, it's very interesting you said, just to follow on from what you just said, Colin, we've had a number of emails written to the gallery saying precisely that, and saying, why isn't more made of that? And where the writers, the people writing have been saying, look, these are images that clearly come out of the Holocaust, that clearly come out of that post-war period, that are absolutely traumatic. And we're in the gallery not making much of that, although there are, Barney's talked to me about this and said, yeah, there are references to this, but it's not a big thematic argument about the show. There's so many of our visitors walking in have responded in the way that you've responded. And I do think we need to address that, whether even if we end up thinking that it's not relevant or maybe not relevant, but we have to be careful how we make those arguments. But I do think we'll need to address that today or in our conversations more generally.
There was a very vivid moment in that interview that you described as Cultural Life, where he mentioned never seeing their faces again, faces of his family, just getting on the train and this complete wiping of his own personal history. And yeah, exactly as you say, the connections with a life that subsequently spent dedicated to describing the encounter with individuals seems so glaringly obvious, doesn't it? But I suppose the question remains, is it not the artist's prerogative to set out the framework for interpreting their work? Trust the teller, not the tale, or I don't really know where we land on respecting that desire to control the narrative.
Well, I think it's for the next generation to sort that out, really. The same with Lucian Freud. Oh, sorry. It's for the next generation to sort that out. And it's the same with Lucian Freud's pictures. They are, he obviously didn't have a narrow escape like Frank did. His family had the means to get out. But I see that Jewish history in Freud's pictures, and I know that some of his family, his daughters do, as I've discussed it with them, but I would never have dared bring that up with him while he was alive. What pictures really mean, that's why we're sitting here talking about them going round and round in circles.
Well, let's try not going round and round in circles. We can make more progress than that.
We won't say, oh yes, that's what they mean.
Great. Okay, thanks, Colin. Another hand is raised at the back there. It's Andrew's hand up. Some of you know.
One of the things that occurred to me as I was listening to some of the talks today was the similarity between Auerbach and Walter Sickert. and some of the pictures that he painted, for example, La Hollandaise, and the use of light and shade in the portraits and expressions. And is there any evidence of how that being influenced?
I mean, I think there's direct and indirect. He had both books of collected writings of Sickert in his collection from pretty much the earliest possible. So I had some fun time when I was doing the chapter trying to compare which pieces of advice were in which edition, the early Sitwell or later. But then also Sickert was really quite important with Bomberg. And interestingly, Sargent encouraged very young Bomberg to take up art when he saw him sketching. So all these connections meshed together. But there is certainly the connection, as I say, through the education system, but then also I think Auerbach has been very vocal about his love of Sickert. And certainly not only the art, but also the writings.
And their shared enjoyment and participation in theatre as well.
Yes,
Yeah.
very much.
The Camden link, and I hadn't thought of La Hollandaise specifically, but since you mention it, I think those paintings of EOW on the Blue Eider Down that Auerbach made in the early 1960s, I think there's a lot of resemblance there.
And of course the long shadow photography in both of their practices. It's more direct and literal in Sickert, but hopefully I've argued that it's also there in Auerbach too.
Great. Other questions from the floor? Yes, there's one right next to you there. Great.
Hi, going back to your papers on resemblance, feeling quite good at the pack number 5 about the lost when you introduced film and the moving images. So resemblance number 4 and 5 quite not get that.
Yeah, so the with each resemblance they get more abstracted and more externalized. So 3 and 4 were, and now I can't even remember, but the point is that resemblance 5 is this much more diffuse resemblance that requires elements from the audience as well, I think. Resemblance when it's a very dispersed resemblance, if you'll allow it. I mean, it's an unresolved thought, so that's probably why.
Why is it objectivity and subjectivity?
Yes, yes.
Yes, question there from, question there.
I know the brevity, and that takes me back to resemblance. I just wanted to add, reading, there's so much written about Giacometti also, going for that thing. And in the David Sylvester interview with him, he says, and this is a translation into English, is it like? Is it like? So all we can say about Auerbach, Giacometti just got back to that very simple point and kind of went round and round in a medium, not like charcoal, not something more hard and precise.
Can I ask a question? Sorry, no, we'll come to you. No, that's your important point.
Right, go back to comments earlier about proximity and distance.
Can you speak up a bit? Is the mic working okay?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Yes, question about proximity and distance in viewing the work and making the work, and I was quite struck, I suppose, by the difference viewing charcoal paintings and viewing the paintings, and that the painting requires a lot of distance from the viewer for the image actually to resolve, whereas the charcoal there was that decide to come to the surface and to sort of have that proximity with it to admire or get to grips somehow with those situations made. So yes, let's take out how you see the drawing and painting practice relating at that period. And when it's just me who can't resolve the paintings at all without stepping back to a distance which feels much more remote than I feel, and obviously within how they're framed, it sort of feels like the view paintings have to step beyond the presumed wall, which is kind of what the situation is, what's the relationship. So it's curious how both sides of painting drawing.
That's a really interesting question, thanks. Yeah, what that sense of the viewer's proximity to or distance from and engagement with the works.
Yeah, I completely agree. I tend to look at the paintings and the drawings very differently, and that thing of having to step back for the image to cohere in the paintings versus the way that Kate spoke about so beautifully about what you're rewarded with from looking kind of extremely close up to the drawings and really kind of getting up close to them. And I think as someone who kind of spends a lot of time with Auerbach's statements and interviews, I think it's always interesting for me to try and, because for me there is that kind of dichotomy in the way that these two aspects of his work fit together, and when he's talking about his work, I often find myself wondering whether he's thinking specifically about the paintings or specifically about the drawings and how they're reconciled within his own practice, because yeah, he does to me seem to be an artist of these kind of parallel practices, which yeah, the way that they coexist is very interesting.
I mean, I would say that I, obviously, from my perspective with my paper, I see a lot of what he talks as being a similar mechanism, but as you say, what that asks of us is very different. And I think that the level of material interposition that asks different things of us is very clear, because that paint, like you say, it's extraordinary to get up close and to feel the empathy, the haptic viscerality of it, but then you can't see anything. Whereas I do love that aspect. I think it's very astute for you to say that with the charcoals, where you have to get very close. And it sort of reminds me of the Rothko saying that you should view all of his paintings from your nose 5 inches from the canvas and just let it swallow you up. And so, yeah, it's an interesting dimension.
Great, thanks. I realise that we're running out of time. Well, not running out of time, but this session is now closed. So I think we're due to now have a break for lunch. So can I ask you all to have a lovely lunch and come back for 1:45. We have a wonderful cafe upstairs, Frequency, that you're very welcome to attend and to have your lunch at. But can I ask you, before we go, to thank James and Kate and Alex for their great start today.
Hello everyone, welcome back. I hope you're feeling refreshed and ready for another lively session. It was wonderful how the conversation and ideas flowed from the first panel. So I think we will take that forward into this panel after lunch, and also I think be surprised and energised by the directions in which our three speakers will take us. My name is Sarah. I'm Sarah Turner, the director of the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies in British Art, and work very closely with Mark when he was the director there, and also on that wonderful book project we published, which Mark and Catherine Lampert edited, which he held up previously. And I also encourage you to have a look at the PMC website, where we have a wonderful film made by John Moore as well, which develops on that book as well. So do take a look at that. I'm going to follow the same format that Mark had in the session before lunch, and we'll have our three speakers present their short presentations together, and then we'll have our discussion and questions and conversation after that. So I'll introduce our three speakers to you briefly. First, we will hear from Dr. Isabel Jane. She's recently completed a PhD in art history at the University of St Andrews, and her thesis was entitled Calligraphies of Time, the Bomb Site in the Cultural Imaginary of Post-War Britain, and that investigated the cultural significance of the bomb site in art and visual culture produced between 1945 and 1969 in Britain. Then we'll hear from Dr. Richard Johns, who is a senior lecturer in the history of art at the University of York. Richard has co-curated exhibitions and published widely on various aspects of British art, from the 17th to the 21st century, with a particular focus on the long 18th century. He joined the department in York in 2013, having previously worked as a curator of art at the National Maritime Museum in London. And then we'll hear from Dr. Gregory Salter. Greg's an associate professor in the history of art at the University of Birmingham, and is a specialist in British art after 1945, with his research to date focused on home and masculinity during this period, and he's currently researching
a transnational history of art in Britain, 1957 to 88. Very interesting dates there, Greg. I sort of started wondering about 57 and 88 there, but we'll get into that another time. So, really looking forward to the presentations. Like I say, I think this spirit of exchange, transaction, conviviality, conversation, that flow from these kind of incredible works that we're looking at. I think it is interesting how some images as well are open to interpretation and looking closely, and how that translates into our ideas and our conversation. I'm interested to pick that up with our speakers and with you as an audience. But first, Isabel, I'm going to hand over to you to start us off. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Before I begin, I would just like to thank Altair and also Layla for the invitation to contribute to this study day to talk about Philip Holmes, an artist who many of you may not have heard of. Holmes was a student alongside Frank Auerbach and Leon Kossoff at both St Martin's School of Art and at the Borough Polytechnic in the post-war years. Together, the three of them formed a kind of trio, describing themselves as a gang of three. My presentation today aims to do three things. The first is to briefly introduce Holmes and situate him as an artist alongside his contemporaries Auerbach and Kossoff. The second is to look at a collection of charcoal portraits that Holmes did in the late 50s and early 60s of his wife Barbara Holmes, who was also a student at St Martin's, focusing specifically on a series of portraits that Holmes did of her during her pregnancies. The third thing I'd like to do is to show how these works provide an insight into the visual imagination of post-war Britain, and I suggest that although they depict a very private and interior subject, they speak more broadly to the collective anxieties and uncertainties of this period. Holmes was born in Bermondsey in South London in 1924 into a working class family. In 1942, at the age of 18, he joined the RAF as a wireless operator. When he was discharged from the armed forces, he secured a place at St Martin's School of Art in 1948, which is where he met Auerbach and Kossoff. It was Auerbach who helped Holmes move from the design course to the fine art programme and encouraged him to join David Bomberg's evening classes at the Borough Polytechnic. When I was writing my undergraduate thesis on Holmes in 2017, I wrote to Auerbach to ask him about his relationship with Holmes, and he responded, writing that the three of them, I quote, didn't quite fit in with the more respectable students and were for some time the only St Martin's students to attend Bomberg's evening classes. In this letter, Auerbach also said that although he visited building sites more frequently in the company of Kossoff, that the three of them did sketch these sites together on occasion, either as part of a St Martin's sketching trip or working on their own individual projects. The three artists also exhibited together in 1952 at the Studio Club on Swallow Street, and Holmes had several solo exhibitions during the 1950s and 60s at the RBA Galleries, the ICA and the Studio Club. Holmes worked with charcoal throughout his career, following David Bomberg's instruction. Here we have an example of one of Holmes's early charcoal self-portraits that he did around the time he started at the Borough Polytechnic, where we can really start to see Bomberg's influence on him. The use of charcoal feels slightly hesitant and restricted, as if he's testing out how to achieve the depth and the shadows of the face through shading, something which he seems to get to grips with in his later work, like this self-portrait on the left, where you can see the very free and confident strokes of charcoal that create this chiaroscuro effect. Holmes's use of charcoal was prolific, and these drawings can be separated into two categories. The landscapes, which included drawings of the building sites that he did both on his own and in the company of Auerbach and Kossoff. And the second category is his charcoal portraits, mainly of his wife Barbara. Although they were often used as preliminary studies for his paintings, Holmes's charcoal drawings are standalone works of art in themselves, demonstrating how integral this medium was for his own practice. Barbara, known as Barbara Bixby before she married Holmes in 1959, was a student at St Martin's on the Art and Design course, and she also studied textiles. She was born in 1931 in Islington and was the daughter of a greengrocer. Straight after art school, Barbara worked as a seamstress for Hartnell and other fashion houses, before becoming an art technician at a school in the 1970s. In this charcoal drawing of Barbara on the left, Holmes depicts her heavily pregnant. Her eyes are closed and she rests her head in her hands, slumped back into the chair. This work was produced either in 1960 when she was pregnant with her son Simon, or in 1961 with her daughter Lisa. What initially struck me about this drawing was how tired she looks. She's quite far along in her pregnancy, and holding these poses, often for very long periods of time, as a life model adds an extra layer of strain. In 1961, Auerbach did this multimedia drawing of what looks like a pregnant woman sitting on a chair. She's upright, her legs twisting to one side, and around her figure, Auerbach applied this dark charcoal shading. I wondered if the model could have been Barbara, given that she was pregnant with her daughter Lisa, who was born in 1961, the year Auerbach did this work. Barbara had modelled for Auerbach in the past. In one of her letters to Holmes in 1953, she writes, and I quote, "Frank is going to work with me on Saturday," which meant that she was going to model for him. And Barbara's family have also shared with me that she told them she did model for Auerbach on occasion, and may have done so whilst pregnant. Holmes's charcoal drawings of the figure are stylistically very different to Auerbach's. Some are much softer and detailed, focusing on the texture of the skin and the facial expression, and others are a lot more angular and sharp, like we see here, where Holmes creates a definitive outline of the body with red chalk, which really accentuates the curve of Barbara's stomach. But some of these works do show with Auerbach the extreme contrast between light and dark to create this chiaroscuro effect. Holmes's studies of Barbara depict the very intimate subject of pregnancy and the prospect of childbirth and motherhood, and I feel that it is important to mention at this point that when these charcoal portraits were made, Barbara had by this time suffered 3 miscarriages, and after finally giving birth to her son Simon in 1960, he tragically died at 6 weeks old. Knowing this, and looking at this portrait, seeing her deep-set eyes, which are heavily shaded to give this angular, tense look as she gazes away from the viewer, it is clear by her facial expression that there is a palpable sense of anxiety and apprehension. In this drawing of Barbara breastfeeding one of her children, most likely Simon, who died at 6 weeks old, Holmes depicts her lovingly looking down at him. She seems content and relaxed. It is a tender, intimate moment between the mother and her child, captured by a proud father. Yet whilst her facial features and her body are clear and present, the baby she holds seems absent, suggested only by the outline of the head, the body and the legs that lean towards his mother. This drawing is either an unfinished work, or Holmes deliberately chose to depict only the outline of the baby, suggesting both its presence and at the same time its ghostly absence. Given the history of the couple's loss and the struggles they faced to become parents, this work speaks to a shared sense of immense pain and suffering experienced by the couple, expressed in charcoal. It is important to view these drawings as not only deeply intimate subjects, but also place them within the wider social context in which they were made, in post-war Britain in the early 1960s. During the war, women had assumed a role in the public space, working outside of the home environment in both military and non-military related jobs. However, when the war ended, women were expected to return to their domestic roles in the home. This was evident in how childcare was limited through the closing of nurseries in the post-war period, and how the working mother was condemned and villainised in the media. the welfare state pushed the idea of the re-establishment of the nuclear family when so many had been broken during the war and Britain had a very low birth rate, and so the burden fell on women to prioritise family life. Barbara herself, who was from quite a traditional family, did not pursue a career as an artist or designer, but went on to become an art technician at a school, exemplifying a very common reality for many women during this time who assumed roles in art education. So for her, becoming a mother was hugely important and represented a kind of binary choice that many women faced, whether to pursue a career as an artist or prioritise family life. By making the pregnant mother and the mother and child subject the focus of his charcoal drawings, Holmes demonstrates how centralised the subject matter was, documenting in charcoal a kind of life cycle that follows different stages of pregnancy, the prospect of new life in the image of the newborn, and of loss. This sense of loss is most evident in this charcoal portrait of Barbara, where she's depicted curled up with her knees to her chest. Her eyes are closed and downcast, her arms limply hugging her body as she turns away from the viewer. There is a sense of shame and sorrow in her expression and in her body language. Rendering her in this way, and knowing the pressures she may have faced to become a mother, and the emotional and psychological impact that her miscarriages and the death of her son Simon had on her and Holmes, this is a harrowing image of trauma and loss. It is through the medium of charcoal that Holmes is able to render such an emotionally charged, haunting image. The contrast between light and dark, the monochromatic tones that make the body look as if it is emerging from a dark hole, the angular shapes of the shoulders and the neck, the whiteness of the limbs like bones, together create an image that reflects this ongoing post-war feeling of loss and recovery. This sense of emerging from the rubble and dust of bomb sites is echoed in the marks made in charcoal on the paper and the layers of charcoal dust that form these post-war subjects. Thank you.
I'd just like to begin with sincere thanks to Altair and everyone else involved in organising today's event for allowing me to come and speak. In some ways, I'm an imposter today because I'm not going to be talking about portraits, but I hope that what I have to say will contribute in some way to the wider discussion about Auerbach's portraits, which has already begun to emerge, and that it might help to form a bridge between the current exhibition and the 2009 exhibition of Auerbach's building site paintings at Somerset House, which Mark mentioned earlier. My talk today alternates between two very different drawings. One, the result of studious, measured observation of a location known to the artist, rendered in heavy monochrome with charcoal. The other, a seemingly carefree, even playful impression of an unfamiliar city, partially coloured in with a handful of crayons. As such, they represent two very different modes of drawing, which in turn seem to encapsulate the contrasting artistic identities of their makers, Frank Auerbach and David Hockney, each captured here at the beginning of what we now know as a long and productive career. Over the next few minutes, I want to expand on those obvious formal differences, looking more closely at each work in turn. But in doing so, I also want to think quite speculatively about what they share in common, and about what that might tell us about the function and possibilities of drawing for British artists working in the late 50s and early 60s. That is, in the decade after the end of the Second World War. On the left of Auerbach's charcoal drawing, we see the steel skeleton and scaffolding of the New Change buildings, a large office complex intended for the Bank of England's Accountants Department. On the right are remains of a bomb-damaged or partially demolished building, and some hoarding that marks the boundary between the New Change site and Cheapside. From inside the hoarding, we look across what could be a builder's hut and assorted building materials towards the dome and north transept of St Paul's Cathedral. There's a suggestion of a few people, builders at work, but not many. Looking at the drawing in another way, less topographically, I'm struck by the accidental smudges and oil stains at the top of the page that read as encroaching clouds or billows of smoke, and by the formal echo of the steel girders of the emerging building in the supporting, and by the formal echo of the steel girders of the emerging building and the supporting grid of yellow lines that attempt to hold the picture together. This merging of substance and subject is pushed to the limit in some of Auerbach's other drawings and in his paintings. But even in this charcoal drawing, which is highly legible for Auerbach, it's difficult to read the pictorial space with any certainty. It's hard to judge where the street level is or was, and where we stand in relation to it. What is new and rising, and what is shored up bomb damage? When does a hole in the ground become the foundations of a new building? Auerbach's post-war city is an unstable, up and down place, still reverberating from the shock of war. Except that in this drawing, St. Paul's Cathedral looms large. The prominence of St. Paul's invites a visual comparison, an obvious one perhaps, with Herbert Mason's celebrated and much manipulated photograph of the cathedral towering above a silhouette of ruins following a bombing raid in December 1940. A photograph that became a defining image of London at war following its publication by the Daily Mail. In the excellent catalogue to his 2009 exhibition of Auerbach's building site paintings, Barnaby Wright is persuasive in distinguishing Auerbach's building site works from the presumed moral certainty of such images, and from the cliché of resilience that they continue to represent. Auerbach's London is more difficult, it's been said. What would happen, though, if we were to position Auerbach's drawing within a longer visual history of St. Paul's in the 20th century, one that extends beyond the experience and iconography of the Second World War? One image that comes to mind, a large painting, is Niels Muller-Lund's soaring bird's-eye view of the city from the roof of the Royal Exchange from 1904, centred on St. Paul's and titled The Heart of Empire. Remember that title. To bring such an image into play is to cast a specific and different light on Auerbach's building site works, and on this drawing in particular, by identifying the towering dome of St. Paul's as a beacon of late imperial identity, in a city determined to reaffirm its status as a global financial metropolis. It's in this light that we might read other marks on Auerbach's drawing, including the annotation at the very centre of the page, very dark, at once a simple observation of a narrow street thrown into shadow by the enormous bulk of the cathedral, and an ominous downward marker of an uncertain future. If those two words point towards the dark heart of empire, to invoke Muller's painting, another, less conspicuous mark on the page inadvertently situates Auerbach's prospect of St. Paul's and the emerging New Change building at a particular moment of imperial crisis and reprisal, and on the cusp of another war. I'm referring to the date inscribed on the lower left edge of the page, August 1956. Days earlier, on the 26th of July that year, the President of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, announced the nationalisation of the Suez Canal Company. It was the latest in a series of decisive anti-colonial measures introduced since the Egyptian Revolution of 1952, which, temporarily at least, brought to an end British economic and military interests in Egypt. Loss of control over the canal was met with anger and indignation from the British establishment, and immediate preparations for a military response, as well as popular demonstrations against the impending war. The ensuing crisis culminated 3 months later, when Britain, together with France and Israel, invaded Egypt in a short-lived and, as far as the aggressor countries were concerned, a disastrous attempt to shore up colonial influence in the region. Hold that thought for a moment with Auerbach's drawing in mind while we turn our attention to the second drawing. David Hockney's view of Tahrir Square in Cairo is one of around 40 crayon drawings the artist made during his first visit to Egypt in October 1963, 7 years after the Suez Crisis or tripartite aggression. An inscription at the bottom of the page tells us that this is a view from the Nile Hilton, a new hotel constructed on the site of a former British Army barracks on the west side of the square. Hockney, it seems, is not overly concerned with mapping the square with any great accuracy, although his drawing broadly echoes the topography of the roads, gardens and walkways that were laid out when the site, formerly known as Ismailia Square, was redeveloped after the 1952 revolution and renamed Tahrir Square, or Liberation Square. There's a bus and the beginnings of a car and the suggestion of a few people, but not many. More prominent than all of this is the abstract iconography of Arab liberation in the flag of the United Arab Republic, a short-lived political union of Egypt and Syria that Nasser hoped would become the basis for a wider Arab Republic. Lining up behind the oversized flag is the international-style tower of the Cleopatra Hotel, newly opened, topped by a giant rooftop billboard for Ethiopian Airlines. Though singled out in Hockney's drawing, the airline advertisement was one of many oversized electric billboards that defined the skyline of Tahrir Square in the early 1960s. Most effective at night, they promoted all manner of goods and services arriving from both sides of the Cold War divide. Cars from Czechoslovakia, watches from Switzerland, Egyptian-made tyres, and most prominent of all, several of the world's leading airlines that connected the new Arab Republic to 4 continents, and which defined Cairo as a global centre of the new jet age. Hockney's view from the Nile Hilton is noteworthy for many reasons, not least because it departs so resoundingly from Hilton's own vision of the touristic experience it was selling. Exemplified, I think, by this advertisement announcing the opening of the hotel in 1958. The new Hilton building is superimposed onto a sandy view of the pyramids and Great Sphinx of Giza, and framed by the new TWA Jetstream, the longest-range airliner in the world today. The accompanying text invites guests to enjoy the pharaonic splendour of Egypt's ancient civilization from the air-conditioning comfort of one of the hotel's 400 rooms. Although he was embedded within the same building, and the hotel's high-rise design accounts for the artist's elevated view, Hockney's disregard for the Western tourist gaze is striking in this and in other drawings in the series, and is matched by his evident attraction to the sites of Egyptian modernity and African unity. Apparently turning his back on a Western orientalising vision of Egypt, Hockney's eye for the Ethiopian Airlines logo foregrounds a Pan-African network that connected Cairo via Khartoum and Addis Ababa to Nairobi in the south and to Accra in the west. One profound effect of the airline's continental reach in the 1960s, according to the Ethiopian historian Baharu Zude, was, and I quote, to cut the umbilical cord that had tied colony and ex-colony to the metropolis. And so, back to the metropolis, to Auerbach's image of London 7 years earlier. Both artists document a city in flux, where Auerbach witnesses a city in search of a new architecture of empire, at the new change in the Shell building on the South Bank, or out of the ruins of the Empire Cinema in Leicester Square. Hockney encounters Cairo as a competitive and contested post-colonial space, where international alliances and Cold War rivalries play out between the modernist buildings and neon lights of Tahrir Square. So the connection I'm making between these two works on paper is loose, but it's concerned with drawing as a form of ground witness in which to pay attention to the local is also to register the global, sometimes in unexpected or unintended ways. Thank you.
Hello. Just to echo my thanks to Altair and everyone for the opportunity to be involved today. The aim of my paper today is to bring Frank Auerbach's charcoal drawings into dialogue with a slightly later set of works by Philippines-born and at that point Britain-based artist David Medaya. These are his Cloud Canyons bubble machines works, which you'll see shortly. These are a series of kinetic sculptures where a mechanical system draws bubbles out of a base of detergent and water to create growing and dissipating foam forms. So if you're not familiar with that, I'll show you a picture shortly. The two artists are quite different, but I'm going to suggest that the comparisons around their materials, their processes, and their approaches to personhood and gender can be illuminating for placing Auerbach's drawings in a wider social and cultural context in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. So first up, material. Auerbach's choice to use charcoal for these drawings came in part from the material's cheapness. Barnaby Wright notes in the exhibition catalogue that it was difficult for Auerbach to afford the vast quantities of paint required for his preferred way of working at this relatively early point in his career. And while the thick coagulated paint of his building site paintings, which are contemporaneous with these drawings, has been read as evoking the kind of earth and mud moved in the process of post-war reconstruction, the black dust and soot of the charcoal of these drawings evokes another public sphere of labour linked to post-war national fortunes, and this is the coal industry. So domestic coal production reached its peak in the mid-1950s, just as Auerbach was embarking on these drawings. But of course it also evokes the smaller scale realms of domestic and the ubiquitous yet increasingly contested vision of the open coal fire, which Linda Need has written about, and I'm taking this image from one of Lynn's articles. Nostalgic attachments to the open coal fire persisted into the 1950s, though legislation and new technologies relating to domestic heating were beginning to dislodge its centrality in the home. What's more, open coal fires were dirty and hard work. By and large, women fetched and prepared, fetched coal and prepared fires for returning husbands, if their husbands were returning, and dealt with dust and grime afterwards. So this evokes the description of the circumstances of Auerbach's earliest charcoal drawings, where Stella West sat for him in a chair in her bedroom, often next to the fireplace, over repeated evening sessions with Auerbach kneeling on the floor to work, as we've heard. So this, to make an obvious point, locates them in the domestic sphere and roots them too in a heterosexual relationship as well. And as I think has been mentioned, we know that one of the reasons that Auerbach stopped working in West's home was the mess caused by using charcoal. Robert Hughes in the 1980s described Auerbach's studio as like a colliery as well. So there's much, of course, to link these drawings to a certain recognisable post-war atmosphere. Though we might also emphasise change here, and that's something I want to think about across this paper. Auerbach takes up charcoal as a medium as the government and as manufacturers are seeking to eradicate the dust and grime of coal from ordinary homes. Medaya's Cloud Canyons, which you can finally see here, these are from Signals News Bulletin, a publication that he made as part of his gallery Signals. This is issue 2 from the summer of 1964. So here you can see these works which seem to bubble and froth with what comes next, almost. Their elongated box forms recall top-loading washing machines, which had become increasingly cheap in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Still weren't automatic at this point, and you get automatic machines kind of arriving in the early 1960s, but not taken up kind of as widely until much later. Medaya's chosen medium as well, detergent, was aggressively marketed to housewives. You could get offers of very flimsy free gifts or heady discounts and these gave detergent marketing a particular air of dishonesty, and became things that women had to navigate with a certain kind of discerning skill. So you're not seeing a detergent advert here, you're seeing a washing machine advert. But I just want to note that Medaille's presentation of the bubble machines in the news bulletin seemed to utilise the layouts and the imagery of contemporary newspaper washing adverts. You can see the kind of different viewpoints, and Medaille almost as kind of the housewife alongside the machine in these images. So in this way, Auerbach and Medaille meet, perhaps unexpectedly, around the changing materials of domestic labour. So labour brings me to the second theme to think about, which is process. And Kate talked about this morning, has talked about this, and many other people have really nicely, perhaps with Auerbach. Again, as we hear in the exhibition catalogue, as we've discussed, Auerbach would complete an image of the sister's head in one sitting, but then, dissatisfied with it, would erase it down to a ghost and begin again on top of this. This repeated drawing and erasing process means the paper he would use would often begin to fray and tear, and as we know, we can see these kind of worn areas that have been patched up to reinforce them in these drawings. So it's not too much of a stretch, as James mentioned and as David Mellor has as well, to see connections with artists like Gustav Metzger and his auto-destructive works. I also want to think about the connections with Medaille, kineticism, and Metzger called Medaille's works auto-creative as well. So I want to kind of offer creation alongside destruction here as well. So this comparison is a way of drawing out back into the wider field of British art in this late 1950s, early 1960s moment. It's also a way of thinking about their mutual concerns with labour as well, with the physically and mentally demanding labour of Auerbach's practice for the artist and for the sitters, meeting the kind of glimpses of labour-saving automation in Medaille's work, albeit this is automation gone wrong. Bubble machines almost. So that relationship between process and labour brings us to personhood and gender. So I'm going to start by thinking about that with a small part of Medaille's presentation of these works in the news bulletin, where he kind of bolds this quote in the middle, and I'm kind of obsessed with this quote a little bit. So this is from a Russian poet, Vladimir Mayakovsky, and it says, "If you like, I shall grow irreproachably gentle, not a man but a cloud in trousers." So this is a line from one of his poems where the speaker is addressing a lover and offering to kind of transform at their behest. So it's been a way for me to think about these kinetic sculptures as connected to desire and the transformations of gender, the body, and the person as well. And we might note the effects of kind of using this alongside a work made out of detergent, a material that's very much linked, particularly in the advertising that I've been thinking about, to the maintenance and support of gender in the nuclear family. But Medaille's works seem to be about excess and transformation, the ability for very things designed to kind of shape gender in very narrow ways to go wrong or to open up new and exciting potentials as well. So I'm using Medaille to spotlight the ways in which the visual effects of Auerbach's drawings create this effect of their subjects both coming into being, but also on the brink of becoming undone as well. And this is conveyed through the mixture of the kind of looming, emerging presence created by the chiaroscuro effects and the fragility of their medium and their substance. In privileging presence over likeness, Auerbach's heads, we should acknowledge, are rarely graspable as gendered bodies as well. I think Kate mentioned this morning, but as beings both present and in emergence. So to close, I want to suggest that Medaille and Auerbach share something of a provisional approach to personhood and even gender here, and that this can be understood in relation to materials, to process, and to labour. Both artists utilise materials that evoke the shifting, everyday space of the domestic, a renewed sight of labour and personhood in the post-war decades. From here, they envision states of unsteady becoming, States which we may want to link to their mutual backgrounds as migrants and of course exile for Auerbach, absolutely. But which we also might connect to shifts in class. Think of the rising kind of consumer boom, the transformation of domestic life, signalled by the shifting attitudes to coal and miracles of detergent that we talked about. There are ways then of pulling Auerbach and Medea away from their respective mythologies and uniting them here around the everyday dramas of the domestic, of making a life for yourself, of envisioning the unsteady state of personhood amid the small yet overwhelming shifts of the ordinary in this moment. So thank you for listening.
So, thank you so much to our three speakers, such powerfully provocative presentations. I love them. What I was just thinking of there was as well the interesting contrast actually between the first panel where we were sort of very intimately looking at Auerbach's practice sort of in the room, in the studio, and I think these papers as well, you sort of, for me anyway, turned me to look at the cultural landscape of the post-war moments as well. So that how through Auerbach's practice there's both that possibility to do the sort of inward-looking work, but also this outward thinking about this period and time of incredible transformation, socially, politically, but artistically as well, and again thinking about those relationships. And I also really enjoyed these fruitful and sometimes very surprising comparisons. You know, I don't know much about Holmes. I haven't ever thought about Auerbach and Medea together. I thought a lot about Medea separately. You know, so again, it's interesting to think how we categorise artists and the kinds of work we do with some artists. And I think there's an interesting thing we could get into here about how some artists are sort of monographized, I don't think that's a word, but you know, sort of kept in their monographic moment. What happens then when we put them into conversations with artists that actually they didn't share much of a social life with, but there is a cultural comparison and landscape to share there. And I think again, the relationship with Hopley, I've never thought, you know, you asked us there, Richard, again to, I think about in surprising ways about connections around themes of creation and construction there. So I think, thank you to you all. And again, I with these short presentations, I'm always sort of on the cusp of, you know, you've given us so much to think about, so many provocations, and I think that's the beauty of them. These ideas are not resolved. So I'm going to ask, and in view of our time as well, we've got quite a tight panel, to open it up to the floor as well to see if other people would like to ask questions and join this open practice of thinking of it. And Luke has got his hand up at the back, so we're straight into thinking with you.
I just wanted to ask quite a political question about the Auerbach's drawing of St Paul's Cathedral. It's squared up, which is something thinking back to Walter Sickert came up in the earlier panel, something that Walter Sickert instructed his students to do: make a drawing, square it up, make a painting of the drawing, or using the drawing. And I'm pretty certain that Auerbach never made a painting from that particular work, though it does seem to be preparatory in some way. I just wondered if you could speak to that theme.
Yeah, I mean, I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that question. You're right. I also understand that there's no painting resulting from that drawing, although there was a painting of the same subject which was exhibited in the Beaux-Arts Gallery the year before. It's one of several drawings that are squared up. There are others in the room who would be more qualified to situate that in relation to Auerbach's practice than me, I'm afraid. Yeah, I mean, I was seeing it as a kind of, you know, formal interaction with the the subject, what its practical purpose was, and whether that is part of Auerbach's process of turning drawings into the beginnings of a painting, I'm afraid I don't know. Does anyone else?
There's a question there and then a question here. I don't know whether...
Well, it is to answer that in some way.
Right.
When I think of squaring up and bit jar, and I think of Coldstream and the use of Roadstool, and that very, very forensic approach to landscape and the cityscape of London. And I think about Auerbach, that's quite interesting, is we often oppose Bondman and his disciples and see them as kind of expressive in some way. And I think that drawing particularly seems to in some ways explode that distinction between the two and bring those kind of two traditions in terms of British art schools together in some way.
There's another theme around education and art education, I think, floating across today as well, which we might bring out more. There's a question down here, Lynn Lead.
Thank you. That was just such a terrific panel. Thank you so much. But I just wanted to use a phrase that Greg introduced, because I think it just seems to raise so many issues about all the three papers, about coming into being and coming undone. And it seemed to me that image of St. Paul's was very much, 56, just about the end of everything. And yet so much uncertainty about what's going to come into being. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about that sort of, what is going on in that image? Because it's not just about reconstruction, because, there's so much uncertainty there. And then I think you could almost think about, there's tragic images of Gardner, which were just to imagine that situation and the idea of expecting to come into being and yet coming completely undone. So Greg, thank you for that phrase, because it just seemed to me to perhaps capture something about the 50s and early 60s, which isn't just about affluence and confidence, but actually about really profound uncertainty as well, in both personal and national terms.
Greg, do you want to pick up on that?
I can do, yeah. Thank you. I think what occurred to me kind of listening to the papers as well, which was brilliant, I think, is to speak to that kind of coming into being and coming undone situation is actually absent in a lot of these works. So I was thinking about the empty spaces really powerfully, the child, but also kind of Hockney's use of empty space and Auerbach's as well in those drawings too. I think I just wanted to echo what Lynn said really, is just that it seems to get at, I think there's an interesting kind of use in absence or emptiness in some of these images, and you can even see it in the charcoal drawings, I think, to an extent, to convey a sense of provisionality, a sense of uncertainty, something shifting. This moment, which may be to do with the war in lots of ways, but also kind of raises other really interesting kind of, brings this kind of global context in as well in really interesting ways.
Yeah, thank you for your question. When you asked what's going on in the St. Paul's drawing, and I suppose one way of attempting to answer that question was to make a comparison of the sort that I think Mark described in the introduction today as a stab at an unlikely comparison. Partly I did that as a way of reorienting Auerbach's building site drawings away from the destruction of the Second World War and into a moment of kind of attempted reconstruction of empire in the 50s and 60s. And so I was trying to begin to explore the space that's created between those drawings. And I did wonder, actually, when first thinking about the subject, whether to focus not on that St. Paul's drawing, but on the many drawings of the Shell building under construction, which, like the New Change building, which was designed and used as an extension of the Bank of England, can be seen as in the context of an architecture of empire, an attempt to kind of rebuild empire.
New money.
Yeah, yeah. So in a way that isn't seeing rebuilding as a narrative of resurgence, but of imperial entrenchment in a way.
Yeah, just to build on that, I think what I noticed that was something working across all three papers is this idea of labour. So, you know, reconstructing London and in many ways reconstructing forms of empire, and the labour that sort of is bound up with that, and then what Greg was talking about in terms of domestic labour and sort of what's going on in the home, and then with the Holmes drawings of Barbara, this sort of labour itself of childbirth and how that was sort of working across all sort of facets of life in a way across papers.
Yeah. Another thing that's again these presentations are kind of working so evocatively together, and I think Isabel, you raised it first about class, and that feeling of outsiderdom as well. And I think again it's interesting to think through the presentations, Hockney as well, that that northern working class status that he explores very much in as well the London Art School context, that movement, his own kind of regional migration, and obviously, and Greg, you brought it up with Madeira as well, the kind of interesting relationships in the post-war moment of end of empire, decolonisation, but the Philippines has an interesting relationship to that. It's not kind of a straightforward mapping onto British Empire, but just a broader conversation about, and I think, Isabel, you raised it again in relationship to drawing and the practices and processes, so I don't know that we could kind of pick that theme up, and I mean this outsiderdom status, and maybe a different kind of artist or different possibilities open to artists in this post-war moment after the Second World War, and what's happening in arts education as well. Do you want to, is there anything you can reflect further on there?
Yeah, I mean, it was obviously, for women in particular, if they were in arts education, they often went into teaching because this was sort of something that could be balanced with family life and things like that. And so you have so many women artists who, are just completely overlooked because that's the route they've gone down. But Philip Holmes was also a teacher. He was head of the department. It was at Havering College, I think, and they were very much focused on, having this traditional life in a sense of, earning money and looking after themselves and, their children and things like that. So it wasn't the sort of, straightforward thing for them as a family. So that the priority was to, hold down solid jobs in education.
Make money from them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think what I like about Madeia's work in terms of outsiderdom is the slightly idiosyncratic way that he looks at ordinary stuff, I guess. So these works kind of sort of like washing machines, but not, and kind of taking on a life of their own in that kind of way. It was interesting bringing him into dialogue with Auerbach for numerous reasons, but I think it struck me is that comparison that I finished with, which was yes. So the Gerda portraits, which are really nicely, really beautifully kind of interpreted in the exhibition in terms of exile and migration and kind of making a life for yourself in Britain in the post-war years. I think so. There's it's not just these. I guess it's not just these artists who are thinking about outsiderdom, but these subjects which are drawing us to the presence of outsiderdom in British culture more generally. I think at this point, that's our point.
Yeah, thanks. Just thinking about Hockney, I mean, it might seem a bit strange to present Hockney as someone who's interested in Arab liberation and African unity, and I don't know whether he was or not, but some of the drawings that he produced in Egypt in 1963, that is what he observes, and that might be something to do with his own outside status or not. And I certainly wouldn't call it an innocent eye that he has, but I think it is an eye that is unencumbered by expectation to a certain extent. And in the drawing that I showed, it's interesting, on the bottom is inscribed "View from the Nile Hilton," and I can imagine Hockney saying, I won't try and mimic his accent, but I can imagine him saying, well, that's what I drew because that was the view from my window. And I think I'm not really concerned at all what Hockney thought he was doing, but I am interested in what's registered through the process of his observations, which might be something to do with the way he's situating himself in relation to the art world at that, what I think is quite a radical moment in his career.
It's definitely like such a shifting moment, isn't it? There's a question at the back.
So this is Gustavo.
Will you just speak up a little bit?
Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you for Gustavo, possible connections, but I've just been rather haunted by the pairing of images currently on display, and also thinking about the affirmation of power within a global context and legacies of the Second World War, and particularly shadows, remnants, things in the background which you can just about make as human presences, and it just seems like the shadow of nuclear threats is haunting over me quite a lot at the moment. The opening of Hiroshima War and all these things, some of that's something which seems vaguely relevant or possible to avoid in the mid-1950s onwards.
Yes, well, I agree completely. So that with the Medea works, he did speak about them in terms of both what happened in the Philippines during the Second World War and the nuclear threat as well, and those things are inescapable with Auerbach as well, from the conversations this morning, which made very clear as well. And they're present here, I think, absolutely. I think what's really interesting about both of these works is that they, that those larger historical contexts kind of linger. They are shadows to these works as well, but they're about the everyday, just going on and living after that, I think, in some ways, and kind of building lives in some ways. So I did kind of reflect, as I was writing this, about thinking about Auerbach and the relationship to the Kindstransport and the Holocaust and where this comes into this. And it wasn't there for time, slightly, but also I'm interested in keeping that connection between moving forward, but also the presence of the past and the present, I guess, in the same way. I'm not sure if I'm putting that very eloquently.
But I think it is interesting as well, the kind of problematics around periodization. So Auerbach would keep saying post-war, a war that's, ended in 1945, but we're looking at works made in the 60s, and other works that will kind of more comfortably, like Hockney, place in the 60s. So I think it's quite interesting how, again, we use these terms and how we periodize artists and their relationship to seismic and cultural events, both of the past that are haunting, but also their relationship with their present, of nuclear war, of the arms race, of space exploration, those things. So I think, again, the relationship of these works to history, just to put it really bluntly, I think is really fascinating. And then how, as historians, we periodize them, it feels really, really pertinent. I think, can I squeeze in another question?
I think we can spend a few more minutes.
Good, right. We're off. Mark, do you want to ask your question?
There's a question for Isabel, really. I have to say I didn't know anything about Philip Holmes, and I think probably that's the case for a good number of us in the audience. And I think it's so helpful, brilliant. You've shown us the work by this artist who's obviously, in a way that's so closely intimate with both Auerbach and Kossov, working in the same circle and very, very intimately with them. But there's two interesting kind of conclusions I've drawn or observations I've made about that comparison. One is when you look at the Holmes drawings, you really start recognising that the kind of pictorial vocabulary that Auerbach is using is not distinct only to him at one level. In a very broad way, it's clearly something that's been shared by a number of artists. And I think the juxtaposition of the works of Holmes and you makes you realise that rather than trying to understand his pictorial vocabulary and rhetoric purely in relation to Auerbach himself, and rather loosely in relation to Bomberg, that you can really see powerful similarities, which is very helpful in rethinking Auerbach, I think. But what's also, to me at least, and this might sound rather connoisseurial and might be a bit harsh, it seems that Auerbach, in doing the same kind of subjects, is operating at a very, very different level of complexity and sophistication. The imagery, even that juxtaposition with the image of the potentially that pregnant of the model who might have been Barbara, juxtaposed with a Holmes image, just shows you in a sense, almost instantly, that Auerbach seems to be operating kind of artistically at a very, very different and maybe more advanced level. So it sounds like connoisseurship and putting in a hierarchy, but I wonder whether your thoughts on that.
Yes, I mean, you know, I think for me it's, you know, for me what they sort of show is how different really, you know, art education is affecting people and what, you know, I think obviously what Holmes is doing is very different to Auerbach. You can sort of see how, you know, the Bomberg influence is coming in, but I completely agree with you, Mark, that there is this sort of, there's something else going on in the Auerbach charcoal portraits, particularly the heads of Leon Kossoff, the layering, you know, there's, it seems like there is almost a different methodology going on in a way. And I think for Holmes there was a sense that although the charcoals were standalone works in some cases, in the majority of them they were sort of preparatory studies for paintings. And he was also more sort of working more towards landscape as well. And you know, you can really, you know, for the purposes of this talk, I wanted to talk about the charcoal portraits, but you can see how he's doing something completely different in the shell building site sketches he did, in the sketches of the building of the Festival of Britain. It's a completely different approach, and that's also reflected in the paintings. So I think it's interesting what you've said about how, you know, different people are responding in different ways to, you know, the same thing. They were all there with Bomberg, but yet people are doing different things and getting something different from the teaching. So, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you. Such powerful presentations, and so you've given us so much to think with, and I feel like we're sort of there's lots of threads to follow up in conversation and further research. So thank you for such a really wonderful and productive panel. I'm having a really good time. Should we just stay and talk a bit more? No, we'll have a cup of tea, and I think we're back in the room at 3:15. Yeah.
Great, okay. I'm sure you'll agree with me, it's been a really stimulating day. Thanks so much for all the speakers for the last panel. It's a scintillating panel, I thought, and those are new ways of thinking about Auerbach and those from that. But I'm really equally thrilled to be introducing and chairing the final panel today. And again, as has been the case over the last two sessions, we've got three speakers, and I'll quickly introduce them in turn. So our first speaker is Altair Brandon-Salmon, who, as I said earlier, has been really instrumental in organising the whole day. And many of the things that have been so very brilliant about it are really down to Altair, so thanks to him. And he's a PhD candidate at Stanford University. He's going to be talking about the void portraits after the Holocaust. Then I'm thrilled to be introducing Pella Cox, who is a poet and an artist, and her talk is Auerbach and the Poets, the Colony Movement. Then finally, last but not least, we have Professor Peter Davidson, who's a senior research fellow at Campion Hall at the University of Oxford. Really pleased to welcome you as well, Peter, to the day, and whose paper title is The Darkness Moves Between the Characters, Auerbach, Peak, Ayrton, After the War. So that sounds a very appetizing trio of papers. So we'll kick off right away. Can I ask you all to give Altair the warmest of welcomes. Thank you.
Thank you. A turn of the head, a tear of paper, a streak of blue, Gerda Boehm's head looms out of the darkness. The first of 3 drawings of Boehm completed by Frank Auerbach in 1961, the work is encrusted with chalk and coal, disintegrating under its own weight. How does a Holocaust survivor, Auerbach, represent another survivor, his Jewish cousin Gerda Boehm? The trio of drawings Auerbach produced of her that year suggests how he responded to the unique challenge of acknowledging his past while situating portraiture as an inherently political act in that moment. These drawings, through their deployment of chiaroscuro, surface facture, and striking use of colour, acted as provocations to break what James Hyman has called a collusion of silence on the legacies of the Holocaust in Britain. Yet Auerbach does not shout into the void, but finds the darkness itself as a potential zone of creation. Auerbach's early life had been shaped by war. He was born in Berlin in 1931, but his parents sent him to Britain in 1939 under the auspices of Iris Arrigo, who created a program to send Jewish children out of Germany. This was the same year that his much older cousin, Gerda Boehm, born in 1907, also left Germany with her husband, leaving behind her life as a fashion designer. Auerbach's parents, the patent lawyer Max Auerbach and the former art student Charlotte Nora Burchard, both died in the camps, probably around 1943. Auerbach would later tell William Feather that I, quote, "I was at no point shocked or overwhelmed by my parents' deaths. It was gradually leaked to me that they'd been killed. I don't know which one, Auschwitz probably." Propelled across Europe by the Holocaust, as a young man in London, the after effects of the Blitz were visible all around him. He processed the conflict through his series of building site paintings, directly confronting spaces of destruction. This world provided its own form of inspiration, Auerbach later noting that, quote, "After the war, because everybody who was about had escaped death in some way, there was a curious feeling of liberty. It was sexy in a way, this semi-destroyed London. There was a scavenging feeling of living in a ruined city." He developed his approach to representation alongside Leon Kossoff and a network of other artists he met throughout the 1950s, many of whom were Jewish. The 1961 Boehm series represents a powerful assertion of Jewish individuality. Auerbach's drawings came at the end of over a decade of experimentation in charcoal works, which had begun under David Bomberg at Borough Polytechnic in 1948. Boehm's husband had died in 1956, and so she represented one of the few strands of Auerbach's family still living. When these portraits emerged, the Holocaust was suddenly more visible than usual in British culture. Adolf Eichmann went on trial in Jerusalem that year for being one of the key logistical organizers of the Holocaust, while in Hollywood, Stanley Kramer's film Judgment at Nuremberg dramatized the trials of Nazi war criminals. It is doubtful that these currents stimulated his heads of Boehm. More important was that this was a moment when Auerbach was expanding his coterie of sitters to include Julia Wolstenholme and Helen Gillespie. Still, it meant that Jewish subjectivity was no longer a private issue. Auerbach's tactics of representation sought to pin down another person's existence. The first head shows Boehm looking down to her left, away from the viewer. Her sharp nose and large mass of hair are immediately graspable, providing coordinates to a drawing which is otherwise in the process of collapsing. Layers of paper have been gummed together to form a laminate support. It's cracked and chipped, the repeated erosion and accretion of chalk and charcoal destabilizing the image's ground. Auerbach, as so often with these drawings, captures an in-between moment when the head is angled away. With the 2 sharp slits for her mouth, Boehm is shown to be silent. The crepuscular environments of the portraits usually suggest a deathly hush, But here the swirls of mark making around the head are full of action. Auerbach's gestures and the streaks of charcoal he leaves behind activates the surface into a fury of restless presence. Bohm here emerges as an individual. She was 54 at this point. Really, she belongs to Auerbach's parents' generation, for, unlike him, she could remember the world she had left behind in Berlin. The liveliness of the image is underlined by the inclusion of a single stroke of blue charcoal on the far right, to perhaps delineate Bohm's shoulder. It means that figure and ground are flattened into one, so that perceptually the drawing lies below the blue streak. Form and content cannot be separated, a powerful idea when representing another human. Presence is achieved by the refusal of illusionism. It announces, I am here. The viewer is made aware of both Auerbach and Bohm simultaneously. This cry breaks the image's silence so that I, the viewer, am confronted by two people, two survivors, who could have just as easily not lived and not made it to Auerbach's studio in Mordington Crescent. As Barnaby Wright has noted, the heads, quote, reveal through their reworkings and destructions how close that presence came to not existing at all. This is never clearer than when Auerbach was drawing Bohm. Auerbach was drawing after a decade where the surface of things was put under enormous strain in art and photography. A brutalist photograph like Nigel Henderson's Wall emphasized the inadvertently arresting textures of a chipped and damaged brick wall in Bow. The surface of Auerbach's drawings resembles the urban detritus of the East End. In Auerbach's second head of Bohm, the paper is scarred with violent swipes of black and white charcoal and chalk to create an intense chiaroscuro, breaking with the subtle gradations of the first drawing. Bohm's head is level, modelled in three-quarter profile, both seeing the viewer and looking past them. The image is built over an intense black ground with the red, white and blue charcoal registering as accretions pressed on, like a brass rubbing of her head. This is where the fragmentation of Auerbach's process of destroying and creating simultaneously realizes a metaphorical power. Bohm is not reduced to an essentialized archetypal vision, but rather is built up, formed by the accumulation on the paper. The sense of a slow accretion reflects the processes that formed the London Jewish diaspora, created over the centuries by waves of European pogroms. There is no imagined unity of form or figure in the drawing, only the hard-won image itself standing as a testament to Bohm. The accrual of marks becomes a delaying strategy for Auerbach to stop himself falling into a schematic rendering of the human head. As T.J. Clark wrote about his impasto, it is, quote, a way of not seeing, or not seeing clearly, or not straight away. There is a sense that each image is constantly surprised by the head, and that surprise carries over to the viewer. I must adjust my vision properly to register her. This interval between vision and perception is crucial, for it defamiliarizes the human form, which the viewer takes too often for granted in art and life. The individuality of the head, the sharpness of Bohm's neck rhyming with her nose, shows Auerbach working out how each feature connects to the other. By attempting to sidestep conventional modes of representation, Auerbach arrives at a head which is harsh and elusive at the same time. Auerbach wrote in 1958 in his article 7 Portraits for Arc that I, quote, I paint the places and the people I know well in order to find their unique image. This uniqueness was all the more significant when he had lived through an epoch where people, Jewish people, were reduced to numbers, the numbers tattooed on their skin, the numbers of dead, almost beyond count, the numbers left as refugees. In his final drawing of Gerda Bohm in 1961, he returns to the first composition, her head turned downwards to the left. The darkness is softer here, leavened with white and blue, her eyes almost closed. Auerbach started with the empty void of his own life after the Holocaust and saw, Not the end, but a beginning, a chance to reassert himself and the people around him. He did not want to erase what had happened, but rather understand how the past of a person could coagulate across their face to form what Leon Kossoff later called a gleam of light and warmth and life. Thank you.
I decided to write a poem. Altair said something about pinning down a person's existence. I suppose my poem is an attempt to pin down this artist's or an artist's existence in words. Poem is called The Colony Room. After the club and bar, which many of you might know, Auerbach frequented in the 1960s alongside his friends Lucian Freud, Francis Bacon, Leon Kossoff, but also some significant poets, including Patrick Kavanagh and the great George Barker. While a boarder at Bunce Court, his boarding school in Kent, and of course while he was a refugee, Auerbach learned English poetry from the anthology compiled by W.H. Auden, A Poet's Tongue, or The Poet's Tongue. In later years, Auerbach often recited, and maybe still does, poems to his sitters. He knows all of Keats's odes off by heart. My poem is conceived as a conversation between Auerbach and the poets. He learned as a child, and those he drank with at the Colony Room. The poem also echoes the interview for X magazine that James referred to this morning so beautifully, in which he was interviewed by Elizabeth Smart and proclaimed, "Painting is a serious thing. Like religion, like love, one does the persistent thing, and then the really remarkable happens. When something is there that wasn't there before, the consciousness, the strictness, and then the image." I've never used one of these before, so forgive me. I'm slowly fast. If I write this studio, will you sit for me? Blind Homer painted what he could not see, and your ambition is bounded by these walls that have no echo. In my gaze, brick by brick, phrase by phrase, I build about your hermit hollow, the dark embryo. I add a ceiling to this page, some walls at the margins. Hold this sheet to a window, and it becomes a skylight. Tossing the page, it flutters to the floor, where, like notes from lips, the greats stare from their plates and say this: it's how one behaves in a crisis. Graphite is more intellectual than slinging colours around that have too much charm of their own. In 1939, they sent you abroad, and in the library at Bunce Court, your fingers scored the charcoal texts, as your parents endured the chambers of their slow explorations. How should I trace you, imitate your strokes, shape my words to the figure of your thoughts? It is as difficult to finish this verse as it is for you to stop painting.
You said you changed the lino 3 times in 10 years, chiselled 1,000 faces from the paint, caked on your studio floor. Are they the blooms of a petrified meadow? This collage of faces, the debris becoming contours, a chest, a collarbone, a landscape, a street, the white circles you draw around the feet. The easel grows like a hoary tree and bends its limb towards me. Tireless you paint the muted tones, while choirs of colour tip from the wireless. You gather paint and Polaroids, trample headlines, columns, fallen bylines. A single brushstroke turns, slaps, becomes a sign. Now you have the lineaments of a face, the chin, an eyeline. I squeeze out words, burnt umber, lapis, my scribble and tattered manuscript, the scaffold in the street. To paint the same head over and over again leads to unfamiliarity. I have been standing over a week. From the aeroplane of my mind, the words fall like bombs. Look for something that corresponds. Create an unfamiliar landscape that's difficult to grasp. Try looking up from under the chin. Here, here, over here, says Barker. Sit down and have a drink. The literature that I prized was anything to do with the nude. Spirit of creative art who whispered to me, don't be queasy, simply write about a tart. And there she is. The rest is easy. Cézanne found climate in form, recited Virgil. O formose puer, nimium ne crede colori. O handsome boy, don't believe too much in colour. Early loss may favour later leaps in the dark. Cézanne said, the goal of all art is the human face. You say, now I am older, my face has become more interesting to me. With one foot in your studio, the other in mine, I am like the child astride the meridian line. This studio never leaves, makes no sound, and cannot be written.
I've been thinking about charcoal and darkness and how they are so important in the art of the mid-20th century, in the years after the war. I've been thinking too about what we might call dark portraits, but I'll end with those. So charcoal portraits first, in their vulnerability to smudging and damage, their complicated relation to the sense of touch, infinitely more complicated and soiling if the charcoal is used as densely as in Auerbach's self-portrait. An image which seems so intensely formed by its medium that it is haunted by the anticipation of its own smudging erasure. As here with the ghost right on, which is and is not present,
already washing out in the ambiguous flood of light, which seems to fall starkly from the top right of the image. And I've been thinking about charcoal itself, a humble medium for bad times, a dirty pigment made out of fire in the darkness. Charcoal, sibling of chalk, dark sibling of chalk, prepared traditionally in solitude, deep into the forest by slow burning in covered clamps, like the fire which smoulders on in the buried beams of a bombed house. Now Friedrich's charcoal burners are proverbially lonely figures, deep in those continental forests which folk tales fill with demons and the spirits of the murderous ancestors. How like luckless treasure seekers, ghost seers, Friedrich's charcoal burners are, and how vulnerable to earthly and unearthly misfortunes. Before the war, the chief association of charcoal portraiture in British tradition had been John Singer Sargent's ravishing, technically wonderful charcoal portraits, as with the turn-of-the-century portrait of the poet Yeats. A counterpart to Auerbach's 1958 self-portrait, a reverse of its darkness, with the fewest charcoal lines set down on the white expanse of the paper to show the poet in a pale jacket on a bright day. Similarly, Sargent's portrait of Gertrude Kingston, darker in tonality than the Yeats, but pale against a richly dark background like a cameo, uses the charcoal to dramatise a flood of light that washes over the sitter from the right. Now again, this is almost the antithesis of Auerbach's tender Göderbohm, where the shadow falls over the sitter's shoulder and rounds her head. Or antithesis again to Auerbach's 1960 portrait of E.O.W., where the pale, sombre-faced sitter is leaning almost out of the picture plane to the right, as if compelled by the wash of charcoal darkness, which is moving across from the left. Charcoal never quite loses its origin as burnt wood, dust and stain and darkness on the page. I can remember the charred timber, the staining, marking, burnt timber of the bomb sites, which was still a major part of all townscape when I was a child, in the years in which Auerbach made his charcoal portraits, years in which the war was still acutely visually present. Altair reminded me recently that Francis Bacon took the seeping, acrid blitz dust from the studio floor to stain his canvas for Eric Hall's grey suit. It is vital to these charcoal heads that they are post-war works of art. The darkness of the blackout, the metaphorical darkness of the disasters of war, haunts and forms them. As in Sylvia Townsend Warner's narrative of the darkness of wartime London, it is indescribably moving to see that city abandoning itself to darkness, as though it were any country landscape, meekly settling down in the dusk, shutters going up in windows, walkers pattering home. Here and there a few modest medieval little lanterns being fetched out and set at the threshold of subway entrances, and the darkness falling. Auerbach's charcoals carry such a strong feeling of post-war, though in time they are edging into the late 50s and 60s, though we remember these decades were still a time of bomb sites and prefabricated houses. Charcoal, or the dark strokes of the lithographer's crayon, or black pastels, are the medium of the 1940s and 50s. Darkness and dark places characterise post-war art as the last creation of the paradigmatic pre-war artist. Rex Whistler had been a Madonna, scribbled in charcoal on the wall of a bombed church, in a moment's pause in the advance after the Normandy landings. The post-war, war-shaped artists I am thinking of here are Alan Sorrell, Mervyn Peake, Michael Ayrton. Sorrell first. So much of his nocturnal painting is reconstruction of the conflicts and fortifications of the British past, sometimes the very remote British past. As with this image of the evening signal, the curfew cannon fired from a star-fortified city over a sad and darkening landscape of the Napoleonic Wars, the past as so often echoing and sounding in the present. Sorrell's imaginations of the English past, the earthworks, the causewayed camps and the wooden castles, are always seen under a blackened sky, night or a storm coming on, as though the movement of history is ever retrograde, always into the dark. Mervyn Peake's Titus Graham of 1946 is a fantastical novel of absolute desolation. And more than anything else, it and its successors, Gormenghast and Titus alone, are fictions of darkness. The darkness of the Piranesian castle which encompasses and dominates the narrative. But what world does the fiction inhabit? The isolated castle in a desolate land of mountain and forest, where one noble family lives out lives dominated by a ritual set of observances whose purpose has long been forgotten. Surely this is a monstrous remnant of some empire destroyed. The luckless heir, Titus, is nourished on nothing, suckled on shadows amidst shadow places. And at the beginning of the second volume, a shadow shifts its length, a spider stirs, and darkness winds between the characters. Some readers contrive to read Gormenghast as archly Dickensian, reassuringly Gothic, ignoring its reality as a terrifying post-disaster world, an old world running down into the unimaginable dust. Michael Ayrton's two post-war illustrated fictions are both set in invented worlds below the earth. The subterranean maze, which is the habitat of the Minotaur, and his own surreal version of hell, which is the setting for the rise of the small, but intensely malign demon Tityrus. The last words of Michael Ayrton's contrafaction of Caravaggio in his later Fabrications, 1974, indicate that he was very much seeing the prevailing art of his youth as dark, as under the long dark shadow of Caravaggio, and death, my tenebris toadies, is what. There is perhaps a limited value in saying a thing is like another thing, but I've been thinking a little of the tradition of the dark portrait, the portrait that emerges from deep shadow. Rembrandt comes first to mind. A number of his self-portraits are nothing more than playful tronies, Dutch character heads, exercises in dressing up. But the works which seem to speak to Auerbach are the darkest etchings, where the ink lines run so close together that the blackness almost floods the page, and the artist's head is modelled insofar as the left-hand side of it is modelled at all, out of that floodwater darkness. With Kathy Kollwitz, the prescient sorrow of even her self-portrait from the turn of the 20th century is already looking towards the sorrows of the next 40 years. By the time of her 1934 self-portrait, the charcoal self who stares out at the viewer is already contemplating infinite sorrow. And if we think also of the worn quality of Auerbach's charcoal heads, the patched, torn, palimpsestic, repaired paper in his great self-portrait, we perhaps see his response to an area of patched up building, patched up and made over clothes. But if we follow him here, Perhaps it is right to think about torn and patched paper itself as a support of an image. If darkness is one vital component of these portrait heads, the other aspect is fragility, the sheer vulnerability of things, of marks on paper, which leads the mind inevitably back to the 1820s, to the decade after another vast destructive European war, and to Samuel Palmer's aching and vulnerable self-portrait, twice as poignant for the splashes and water damage on the surface of the paper. A little-known work that seems to me to bring many of these elements together is Albert Hadhausen's Blindfolded Christ. It's in my own college's collection in Oxford. It edges the charcoal head, almost as a genre, the charcoal head, close to the paradigmatic work of the end of the war, Francis Bacon's three figures, the Blitz, crucifixion, the sun darkened at the third hour. There's a confluence of circles here, Francis Bacon, Roy de Maistre, Albert Hadhausen. Here we have, in the Hadhausen charcoal head, an extraordinary play on portrait and on literal and perceived darkness. God blindfolded. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, all three, for bringing together such a really interesting range of perspectives on Auerbach and giving us a very interesting end of day mixture of different kinds of texts, different kinds of reading. So, can I ask for questions from our audience again, for any of our speakers, or for some of the, or in response to any of the broader issues that have emerged through this last panel? And then maybe towards the end we'll think about ways in which we might try and connect all the things we've been listening to today, and to get your thoughts on some of the themes that you see as most important and most relevant as we take our thinking about Auerbach forward. So any initial responses or questions to anything you've heard over this last panel would be very welcome. Yeah, Luke, if we can race to that now.
Hi, I wanted to ask about this theme that Ante brought up, the relationship that Auerbach has to the Holocaust. And I wanted to mention Max Sebald, and I think you know what I'm going to say, that in his novel The Azkaban, he reproduced some of Auerbach's work and attributed it to a character who was called Max Auerbach. Auerbach subsequently refused to allow the reproduction of these drawings in the English translation of The Immigrants, and which is, I take it to be a pretty firm act of refusal to relate his work to a history of the Holocaust. I wondered what you had to say to that, and in light of your own kind of the theme of your paper.
Yes, thank you for that, and thank you also for introducing Sebald into this discussion, because I think his writing speaks so powerfully to what Peter has been talking about, also Pellé's invocation of these overlapping kind of worlds, and Sebald's sort of fictionalization of Auerbach's migrant narrative. It shows in a way that, what we've talked about earlier on, in the way that perhaps the way Auerbach's been written about from only a certain select and approved vantage points. Here, this fictionalization was a way for Sebald to kind of think in different ways about how Auerbach had been formed, and use him for his own purposes as well as a novelist, as an artist in his own right. But I think more specifically around the Holocaust, it shows too the kind of very difficult ways that people whose lives have been profoundly marked by this incredible, awful destruction of European Jewish world had to come to terms with it, whether that was through silence, whether that was through assertion of survival, whether that was through a kind of assertion too of not being marked by it, right? I think that was, we've talked about how Auerbach's strategy of dealing with the deaths of his family and other relations was by claiming that, you know, this hadn't marked him, right? That this is nothing to do with, you know, who he is as an artist subsequently. And we might contest that. Zabald has contested that. I, you know, perhaps contest that in my paper as well. But not to say that, you know, he is an artist because of this, although very dramatically he is in Britain precisely because of, you know, Iris Arrigo and his parents' decision in 1939. But as so many artists, Jewish and non-Jewish, and as Peter, I think, was also pointing to, how do we make sense, how do we create art after this kind of conflict, you know, to sort of paraphrase Adorno, what kind of responses would be appropriate in this moment? And it's perhaps not surprising that suddenly portraiture was suddenly an urgent question in 50s British art, whether representational or through an assertion of the artist's presence, such as Metzger, you know, throwing acid at sheets, right, saying, I am here, I'm creating this artwork in process, which we could understand as a form of self-portrait. And this claiming of subjectivity, of individuality, seemed like an essential, existential question in this moment in 50s Britain. Broadly, the cultural experience of the Second World War.
Thanks, Alter. You'd like to add to that? I think that question was quite clearly directed at you, Alter.
Well, please.
I do have something to say
yeah.
about exile and also Auerbach and poetry in response. You may all know about Keats's theory of negative capability, which is an investigation into an artwork and the creative process being allowed to be unfinished and broken and uncertain. And of course, as I said, Keats, Auerbach knew all Keats's odes by heart, and he must have embraced that idea. And also the Romantic poets, of course, they wrote about Darren Corton in terms of Auerbach, but also Shelley left England because he'd been exiled, self-imposed or not, because of his defense of atheism, and went round to Italy and wrote Julian and Madeline, which is a very humanist poem. And it was Shelley who coined the phrase the paradise of exiles in this poem. And also, of course, while he was in Italy in exile, he wrote The Mask of Anarchy, which was one of the great protest poems of our time. And maybe he could only have written that while he was away from home.
I think that's both of you been so eloquent. I have little to add, actually.
That's good. Thanks, Peter. Any other questions that come up in response to that final panel in particular? Yes, Richard.
Thank you all for your papers. This is a question for Pele, really, but maybe something that the others might want to respond to as well. I'd be interested to learn more about your working process, how you work with word and image together, and whether you are kind of writing and compiling those images as one piece of work, or whether you write a poem and then find the images, or the other way around.
Oh, the images.
Yeah, so how integral are the images that you showed to the work that you presented?
They were actually an afterthought. I probably wouldn't have been able to muster or dig for the words that I did if I had been knowing that these would have been supporting me. I tried to, it was a question, writing this poem was a question, is it possible to, find this magic in words of Auerbach? And I only saw the exhibition this morning, and it was wonderful, and
it was good I only saw the exhibition this morning as well. But yeah, I hope the images helped. I don't know if they were good.
Very good. Yeah. I have a question right at the back.
Hi, thank you. It's a question for Peter. I'm really interested in the connection between Kollwitz and Auerbach, and I just wondered whether you might be able to say a little bit more about that. I know you touched on it in your talk. And yeah, I guess I'm interested in Kollwitz's journey from painting to drawing, and how she sort of graduated to drawings and etchings.
She does actually draw quite early, as part of her practice in the 1900s. She lived a kind of withdrawn life for a good bit of the middle of the century. She sort of retreated to a small house by a lake and didn't really, as far as I can see, didn't much interact with her contemporaries. But I think after the war, her work got very much into circulation. And though, as I said, there is a limited utility in saying a thing is like another thing, though I was very pleased to see what the postcards in Auerbach's studio were. So not all one's guesses are bad guesses. But I would be very surprised if he hadn't seen particularly those mid-century charcoals, because it seems to me that in those something almost prophetic is happening. That there is a sense of the person urgently, I think the only word is warning. I don't want tropes of prophetesses, but that there is those eyes that stare at you from the 1934 charcoal self-portrait are just sort of extraordinary, having seen and warning. And I think he picks up some possibilities of charcoal from what she does with darkness. I think that's your answer.
I think there was also a lady just here who's...
Sorry, I've got 3 hands, or 2, or 4 hands. Suddenly, there's one quite close to you, Maddie, on your left. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. I wanted to pick up on the use of the words accrual and accretion, especially with using those descriptions of art making. And this morning we talked a lot about destruction, but actually that's a lot about creation and about the ways in which even the use of the erasure is actually a bringing of light into some of these dark spaces, and the way in which these areas of darkness are built up so heavily. I wondered if you felt that there was something in that about the layering of memory and the layering of happening. You mentioned existentialism as well, and that great exertion of existence over a kind of evoked subjectivity that an existed and an immediate subjectivity that is something that's going on there with that idea of accretion.
Yes, thank you. I think certainly with these drawings where you can, as we saw earlier this morning, previous states of these drawings and how they could change quite radically, that the darkness is also almost hiding what had come before, and sometimes you get these hints of ghosts almost of previous versions that have been patched over or hidden or allowed to come out. But and this is also all about Auerbach, right? We feel his presence because we can see his surface mark making so visibly, and we see images of Auerbach, portraits in his studio. It's all about labor, it's all about work. He's paint splattered, he's in overalls. That post-war moment of the artist as laborer. We can also think about abstract expressionist self-representation of that moment too, that art was hard work, and that it was hard work, moreover, in capturing the presence of another person, and it should be hard work as well, right? And that the process for Auerbach of scraping back, redrawing, patching on, allowing us to see this kind of process taking place is also what allows him to, again, use that line, a hard-won image, right? It's all about the effort, because if art's easy, I think, for Auerbach, I think he has that almost, almost German sense that if something's easy, maybe it's not worth doing at all, right? And that part of the effort is also acknowledging someone else's individuality and subjectivity, and that's hard work. That's not easy. It's easy to dismiss someone or look past them or not understand them as another person separate from one's own ego and one's own perspective. And that's what Auerbach is perhaps trying to do with these drawings, these portraits that he's returning to repeatedly in this moment.
Can I ask a question which is more about, I'm just reflecting, trying to reflect on the day, and the way in which we've had three different panels that one way or another have had three very different kinds of character and tone, actually. And it's very interesting, this last panel feels very poetic and impassioned. Do you see what I mean? It's quite interesting that all the ways you've been reading your scripts, talking about the work, and engaging with it with a particular kind of rhetoric and a particular kind of language, for the most part. And then I was thinking about the middle panel, where there was a very different side of, I mean, it'd be interesting to get a sense from all of you, whether you can sort of see what I'm talking about here, that there was about something where it was almost like three speakers who stepped back a bit, cooled down, as it were, and were looking a bit, and then making comparisons between Auerbach and other artists, or between, in all cases, in a way that felt not so invested in that sense of the close reading and of the poetic reading. And then if you think about the first panel, that felt something different again. I don't know again how best to describe it, but something that was very analytical. There was a literary and philosophical kind of aspect to it, and that again wasn't so much about history, but it was a certain kind of analytical framework that felt different from panel 2 and different from panel 3. And I do wonder about what that suggests about Auerbach studies, about the way we might take it forward, or about the ways that we respond to his work in kind of slightly separate or compartmentalized ways. I'm just throwing that out there. Does that resonate with both the three of you and with members of our audience? I'm just trying to sort of pick up a sense of the day.
I think, as one of the organisers, that was definitely my intent. To group together speakers and papers that I thought were going to chime with one another and have their own distinct tone, and so that we didn't have 9 people singing the same hymn sheet, so to speak, but bringing very different perspectives to bear. And I think, Isabel's paper on Philip Holmes, right, presents us also another kind of almost existential meditation on what it means to engage so intimately with the presence of someone else, or of other people, right, mother and child. There's such a foundational image of Western art, and yet here it's particularized, it's individualized, it's not an archetype, it's not a generic invocation of innocence. Far from it, it's about the corporeal reality of that other person emerging in a particular space. And so we can see how these ideas are in circulation and they're not unique to Auerbach, right? It goes without saying, Kossoff is obviously a significant figure here who perhaps hasn't been mentioned as much, perhaps because we all understand that relationship or are aware of it. But it perhaps says something about what is happening in 50s and early 60s Britain, too, that is not so reflected upon, this other strain of British art that's standing parallel to what's happening with pop art and Richard Hamilton, This Is Tomorrow exhibition and so on, that is more commonly remarked upon. And these are all people marked by the war in various ways and are trying to work through that.
Yes, people are still working on, the people who are still working on the past. It's slightly generational. Dates of birth are slightly in there, as in with the poets he's in dialogue with. But I think you do have, as so often, as always, you have 2 or 3 strands actually moving in parallel at the same time. And the chronology is a very, as we've seen this afternoon, chronology is a very strange thing. When did post-war end? I would love any views on when a post-war did end.
Right, Linda, a few
I would
next.
just like to say I've known Kelly since she's a very, very young girl. And high. Your poem is just
Really
you grew up in
great.
a household of very talented sculptor, so you've been surrounded by it all your life, and many congratulations. So how is your presentation turned into a poem? It was so beautifully presented, following on Kelly, that it was really quite seamless to me.
I was just so fascinated if we were going to end up using the same assonances. So nearly did.
It was as if one poem gave rise to the next. It was such a beauty.
Well, thank you. I think a
Kelly,
hard act to
well
follow.
Well, hard like to see.
It's nice to get a round of applause like that from the day. Thank you. There were some more. Yes, a question here from the front. Sorry, I know you've been waiting as well. So should we go to you first? Sorry, and then I know you've been waiting too, but we'll make sure we get both of you in.
Thank you for your presentation. I came from abroad, so maybe I can hear, but I really have maybe a general question for you, because I wanted to ask how much is Frank Auerbach considered as Holocaust or also artist here in Britain? Because in my consciousness, he was always considered as an artist strictly related to theoretical aspects, or maybe like the aspects of energy, line composition, and the effect of the sensation of the person or the object in front of him. But here I can really hear that it's really related to the post-war moment in Britain. And I wanted to ask, how is he considered here? Is it more the theoretical aspect, as you presented? And what about later works, not from the 50s?
Any thoughts on how he's typically perceived here?
Well, I think some of the key themes that have been touched upon, but maybe not so much emphasized, has been that, Auerbach's relation to the old masters. He's always talked very powerfully about going to National Gallery and looking at Rembrandt, and we saw, I think, earlier today, one of the drawings that he made from Hero and Leander. And Auerbach's often also presented as a portraitist, because that's a through line throughout his entire career. He had an exhibition of self-portraits only last year in a gallery. So this is, fundamental to him, and I think this formalist understanding of Auerbach and his relation to art history has been, perhaps 15 years ago, might well have been the predominant one, but I think in more recent times, from exhibitions, from what Paul Mellon Centre has done, what Barnaby Wright's exhibitions at the Courtauld have done with building sites, and now these portraits have, is presenting a different kind of critical position, a different point of view to take in. It shouldn't be the only one by any means. I think we shouldn't reduce Auerbach to just where he came from. It's also important where he goes, particularly from the 60s onwards. But just a kind of reflection on these aspects of Auerbach's art that previously were de-emphasized, most of all by Auerbach himself.
And just to add to that, just to respond to your question, I think, and I guess I'd be interested to see what other people agree with this, I think an alternative way of looking at Auerbach in broader culture is around the School of London grouping. And so often he's exhibited alongside or talked alongside Lucian Freud, Francis Bacon, sometimes Michael Andrews. And that's a very typical way in which he's understood in relation. All of them have got these individual mythologies, as it were, but they're a kind of a constellation that are continually invoked when talking about Auerbach or in relation to one another. So I think, in some ways, what's been really interesting about today is that network or that set of points of reference has been broken away from it, and we've been hearing, been given some very new and, in some ways, surprising, but in some ways more powerful and convincing, which is equally powerful and convincing comparators as well today, I think. Sorry, at last, I've been waiting to come to you.
Just two things. First, Altair, I wanted to say about the relationship with Leon Kossoff. I saw those three charcoal drawings together. I've never seen all three, and I've never seen them together. And the quality of them, that sort of angelical look, so feminine, and it made me, there's something that made me want to know more about that relationship and uncover more about that. And the other thing I wanted to say was, I can understand an artist not wanting to make a very direct link between their own life history and their work. And I think we know other artists who bulk at that as well. They don't want that sort of straightforward explanation about why they do, that contextualizing of what they do in that straightforward way. I'm thinking of the artist Mohammed Sami, who's come here from Iraq and does such beautiful work. And I think the important thing is that artists come here and they do have that opportunity to work in this country and to work as producing a lifetime of work here because they can't do it where they come from.
Yes, and just to go off that point, so many artists of that generation were refugees, whether that, or had come from Germany, like Freud or Bacon, who was born in colonial Ireland. They had all come from different parts of the world. Even Leon Kossoff, who was born in East London and grew up there, subsequently was part of the Jewish brigades in the British Army and administered the Balzac-Belsen concentration camp in 1946. So he was right there, administering and processing survivors from those camps in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. So many of these artists, have come from other places or have gone out into the world and then come back to London. Maybe this is a moment to retire the School of London as a moniker in some senses, because it kind of implies that all the, that they just lived in Soho their entire lives, and that was the extent of that cultural reference and framework, which was totally not the case.
I think there's a wider thing in 50s art that you might find also in particularly music in America at that time, and the way that W.H. Auden articulates himself as an exiled or semi-exiled poet in the 1940s and 50s, that there is a whole sense that, I'm thinking of such works as Auden's The Age of Anxiety or Samuel Barber's opera Vanessa, that these really are all works where exile is the theme. And in some ways they're all works generated by people immensely excited by where they are, wonderful point, and to some extent also aware that they are in fact exiles. But I think that this goes wider than Britain, and it's a very interesting way of looking at quite a lot of the best art, Nabokov's Spellfire, of America in the 1950s as well. I'm not sure that's strictly relevant.
No, I thought that's a really interesting point, and I think it again resonated. I could just see from the audience response that felt there was something really powerful in that. So thank you very much. Other questions at all? Yes, the man in blue.
We've been talking today as if these charcoal drawings are kind of a period style, period technique. I was wondering if what William Kentridge might have mentioned, that someone who's doing something very similar, big charcoal drawings, one after the other, rubbed down. Each one actually, in recent times, becomes a still of a video. But I don't know, just the same more connection than just technique of interest to your view.
Any thoughts about Kentridge and Auerbach in dialogue? It was interesting that point that reference or that comparison is made in our book.
And I would just add on to that the sort of resurgence of black figurative art in both Britain and America, whether that's Claudette Johnson using incredibly gestural application of paint and charcoal, or Lynette Yerdan-Bocquier's, clearly informed by Sargent portraits, emerging out of these crepuscular environments, is building upon and in dialogue with this, if we want to call it, tradition of representation, and then doing something different with it. But I mean, I take your point entirely. I don't think charcoal portraits are kind of dated or period, but in fact very much part of the live artistic material available to people today.
Thank you for that. Any other questions to round our session off? No? Okay, well look, that's been such a rich day. Can we begin by thanking our three speakers? And yeah, I just want to wrap up by thanking all of you for coming. It's interesting, when we generated and published the book, and Sarah was very involved in that at the PNC on the portrait heads, I wondered whether, not that we'd said the last word, but I wondered how many more things one could say about Auerbach's drawings, but always thinking there was plenty more to be said. I think today has really proved that there's, this feels like a field that's opening up, and one that somehow gives us both the ability or the potential ability to come to a really closer understanding of the works from close up, and that's one of the things I think from Kate's paper this morning through to your poem this afternoon, Pele, that there's that ability to really work closely with the surfaces and the individual textures and details of these works. But it also feels like there's a simultaneous pull to move our perspective outwards and to have a sense of the broader picture. And I think, again, the sessions where we were able to, whether it was Peter just now or our middle session speakers, as it were, making those comparisons, some of which were totally revelatory in the sense of not knowing this artist. And it's wonderful that we've got some of Holmes's family here today, which is a great a tribute, I think, and a great way to pay tribute to his contribution to that work. But also artists that we feel we know well, but have been rarely brought into dialogue with Auerbach, like Hockney, for instance. And then the Medea comparison, it felt left field at the beginning. By the end, I was utterly convinced. I had one hand in the fireplace and one hand in the dishwasher. A strange feeling, I have to say, but I did feel connected. So so it feels like, it does feel like we're in a process of really rethinking and reimagining the post-war period, or that period of the 50s and 60s. And as Sarah alluded to, maybe breaking down some of the clear boundaries that we tend to have in our heads between those two decades, and about the kinds of practice that went on within them. So huge thanks to you all, huge thanks to our speakers. This has been by far more than the sum of its parts, I think, and that's always what you hope for on a day like today. I want to thank Layla and Maddie, who's been racing around. This is your 10,000 steps at the moment, Maddie, helping us with the mics, and all the Research Forum team. But most of all, thanks all of you for coming and for making such positive and regular contributions to the discussion, and to give us a real sense of spirit and of energy and of an historical inquiry, which is what the Courtauld is all about. So it's wonderful that we can do that. And please, can I ask you not just to come to this event, if you're new to the Courtauld, and I know some of you are, please come. We have an extraordinary programme of events here in the Research Forum. I think this week we had 4, if not more, really major research events, fascinating ones taking place here. So please sign up and sign in and come along to our events. You'll see that they're of this character on a regular basis, and you'll find lots to stimulate. And I think relatively most of them are free, or entirely all of them are free. I should know that by now, but there's very few barriers to coming and enjoying them. Okay, we've got some drinks now next door in our Research Forum room, so please stay with us and join us and carry on the conversations. We've got some soft and drinks and some wine next door, if we can all squeeze in, and thanks again. But can I ask you before you all quite stand up, one last round of applause for all our speakers and crowd here.